Well, hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, both those of you who are here today in person at the National Academies, as well as those of you who are joining us online today to this open session of the National Academies Committee on the Attribution of Extreme Weather and Climate Events and their impacts. My name is Jim Hurl. I'm a professor of atmospheric science at Colorado State University, and I have the honor and the pleasure of serving as chair of this committee. And in just a bit, I will ask the rest of the committee to introduce themselves. First, if we could go to the next slide. I'd like to just emphasize our expectations for conduct. We are committed in all of the activities of this committee to fostering a professional, respectful, and inclusive environment where all participants can participate fully in an atmosphere that is free of harassment and discrimination based on any identity-based factors. Next slide, please. I just want to say a few brief words about this study. This committee has been called together. This is our first in-person meeting. It's been called together to examine the current scientific understanding of attribution of extreme weather events and their impacts to climate change, and to also consider user needs and opportunities to improve attribution science capabilities. Specifically, this is a consensus study, so the committee is just beginning its activities, which will extend over the next 18 months or so to produce a consensus study on this topic. There was a 2016 Academy report that's up on the screen right now, Extreme Weather Events in the Context of Climate Change. This study is an update to that study, but also an expansion of that National Academy study. And you can see the study sponsors listed there, and we have the opportunity in this open session to hear from some of these study sponsors. Next slide, please. So a few more words about the study. What I'd like to remind everyone of here at the outset is that this is an information gathering session. That is, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask everyone here today to be extremely mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions on this topic, and it would be a mistake for anyone to leave here today thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including members of the committee, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the academies. In addition, committee members may ask probing questions in these information gathering sessions that may not be indicative of their professional or personal views. I also wish to emphasize that today's meeting is the first of many opportunities for the committee to gather information as input to our report. For instance, in May or April, the date's yet to be determined, we will be holding a 2-day workshop. That's May or April of 2025. That will be open to the public and include opportunities for members out or for colleagues outside of this committee to join in our discussions. Upcoming meetings, including information about the workshop and other information gathering opportunities, will be available on the committee's website, and I would encourage you to take a look at the committee's website. That is also where members of the public can always submit feedback on the project via the website. Finally, I want to emphasize that this committee will be very deliberate and thorough in writing its draft report. Moreover, once the draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and the committee must then respond to this review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the Academy's Report Review Committee and the Academy's president before it is considered an official Academy's report. If you have questions about the study, as you see at the bottom of the screen, please contact the study director, Rachel Silvern. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the statement of task of the committee. You can see the words there on the screen and can read it yourself, but I just want to briefly go through the main tasks. So first of all is to provide an updated assessment of the previous Academy's report and specifically discuss the current scientific understanding and capabilities for attribution of extreme weather events to climate change. We're also going to discuss the value of attribution science in this study and its utility for different applications. We're going to assess current capabilities for the attribution of impacts. We're going to examine the various methodologies that are in use today for extreme event attribution. We're going to assess both the research and operational efforts currently to produce predictive probabilistic forecasts of future extreme events. We're going to provide guidance about how to extend the application of attribution science to regions experiencing extreme events without well-established capacity. We're going to provide guidance for methods to engage different stakeholders with the results of attribution science. And we're going to identify research priorities for improving extreme event attributions. So that is the statement of task of the committee. Next slide, please. So this is the committee, the members of the committee. I've already briefly introduced myself. I'd like to go around the table now in the order of the names listed on the slide. I believe Hillary is not with us at the moment. She will join in just a bit. So let's start with James. Just briefly introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm James Doan from the NSF National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Nicole Jackson, Sandia National Laboratories.
Joyce, are you online?
Yes, Joyce Kimutai, Imperial College London.
Jennifer Marlin, Yale University.
Delta Murner, the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Tim Palmer, a Royal Society Research Professor at University of Oxford and previously Head of Division at the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts.
Hi, I'm Kevin Reed, Stony Brook University and the New York Climate Exchange.
Monica Sanders, the Undivide Project, and Georgetown University.
Deepti Singh, Associate Professor, School of the Environment, Washington State University.
Smiley, Department of Sociology, Louisiana State University.
Tanisha Stevenson, Department of Physics, the University of the West Indies.
Dennis Toddy, Director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub, USDA Ag Research Service.
Danielle Tuma at the University of Texas at Austin.
Grace Yan, a professor from Missouri University of Science and Technology.
Okay, and again, Hillary Boudet from Oregon State University is a member of the committee, and she'll be joining us in a bit. So thank you, my colleagues on the committee, for those introductions. Next slide, please. Okay, I just briefly want to elaborate just a bit on the agenda for this open session this afternoon. The purpose of this meeting this afternoon is for the committee to gather information from today's speakers. We will only be taking questions from the committee during this meeting to make effective use of very limited time and to prioritize the information gathering purpose of this meeting. Additional open session meetings, as I said in my introductory comments, will provide an opportunity for questions and input from members of the public. This meeting is being recorded and will be available on the event page in the days following the meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, so the study has the sponsors that are listed on the slide. We're going to now have an opportunity to hear from the sponsors. We're just remind the committee, the sponsors have been asked to make about 10 minutes worth of remarks. We can then ask clarifying questions over the next few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so. After we have heard from all of the sponsors, we will open it up to the committee for a broader discussion where questions can be asked to individual sponsors or to all of the sponsors as a group. So with that, I think we're ready to turn it over to Kelly Levin from Bezos Earth Fund.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks also for the tremendous contributions of this committee. It's very exciting to be at this stage. I was asked to reflect on a few questions, the first of which was, why are we interested in sponsoring this study? And there are really two primary reasons. One is that this is an enormously exciting field of scientific discovery. When you think about how fast this science has developed, it's quite unparalleled with many other advances in climate science, and real-time or near real-time attribution of specific events is, while it's still emerging and recent, there have been these tremendous advances, and new opportunities are emerging to help the public directly contextualize their lived experiences within a framework provided by science. And when you think about just 20 years ago, the first formal individual event analysis, you can think about the European heat wave analysis of 2003, which showed the role of warming. And then, fast forward to today, the capacity that we have right now, it's incredibly exciting that scientists are now able to provide decision makers and the public with very clear statements about the relationship between long-term climate trends and individual weather events. So part of this is really for us around this rapid scientific discovery. And the second is that obviously there's been a lot of established research that shows the connections between extreme weather attribution and increased public understanding that climate change is happening, that it's here, it's now, as well as the willingness to prepare for climate impacts and participate, for example, in adaptation efforts. And this can help, cut down response times, for example, and protect health and human lives. And there are a number of studies that have established this, that, people, the extent to which people consider climate change is principally affected by their perception of climate impacts as both current, as proximate, and affecting the things that people care about. And this work is quite relevant here. Obviously, the salience of climate change and support for action. We know that there are a number of different studies that show, for example, in the UK, following a major heat wave attributed to climate change, the proportion of people that said that environment was an important issue facing Britain increased about 12 percentage points. And in another study, research found that even a brief amount of localized climate reporting from, for example, meteorologists helped viewers have a more accurate understanding of climate change and expectation of impacts, and were much more engaged. So that's a little bit about kind of why we're interested in this study. And I was also asked to reflect a little bit about how this study fits into the broader work of the Bezos Earth Fund. For those who don't know, this is the Earth Fund is Jeff Bezos's $10 billion commitment dedicated to two urgent imperatives. One is halting the loss of nature and biodiversity, and also addressing climate change. And we have a focus on environmental justice and equity that crosses both of those objectives. And one of our key programs is investing in world-class data and world-class science. And we're really excited to have a much broader effort advancing the science and communication of extreme weather attribution. One of the key ways that we work is bringing really best-in-class partners together that are better together. And we seek out great institutions working and help them work together through our funding. So, for example, we have an initiative dedicated to advancing the science and communication on extreme weather attribution, working with Climate Central and World Weather Attribution and Yale Center for Climate Communication and GSCC. And there we have two central elements. One is really dedicated to the science, akin to what you all are doing, and further developing the links between climate change and extreme weather and making connection to impacts. And the second is around educating and engaging citizens and advancing the social science around communication of findings to inform decision-making. And we are very excited to support this study in that broader context of the work that we're pursuing. And lastly, I was asked to just reflect on what kind of outcomes we would expect from the study and what kind of information would be most important to various stakeholders. And I thought the statement of task was terrific. And as I was putting together a list of what I hope would be covered, it very much aligned, where hopefully we can have, the very latest science related to attribution of particular types of extreme events, both covering kind of daily extremes as well as large-scale events, with enhanced understanding of where our confidence is the strongest and the weakest and the major uncertainties. It would also be really great to have an assessment on the methods related to extreme weather attribution, and current capabilities and kind of where the field is headed with regard to methods, including some model improvement needs. I thought it was terrific to see the emphasis on data gaps. And when you think about, especially over the African continent, how do you advance the science when the underlying data may be very sparse? And that's, I think, much needed. I think also understanding how extreme weather attribution connects with impacts on the ground and what you can say about that would be helpful to touch upon. With regard to communications, what kind of formats work and what kinds of, how do you reach wider audiences with this incredibly important science? I also was thinking, and I didn't see this in the statement of task, that it might be interesting to touch on the role of AI and other possible game-changing developments that could advance the science. But I assume that this would be very much connected with the emerging research priorities, but it also might be kind of more of some of the emerging research opportunities, where advances in kind of other fields may help this body of scientific inquiry. So I'll pause there and look forward to this discussion. And thank you very much for including me today. And thank you again for all of your tremendous contributions.
Thank you very much for those opening comments, Kelly. I'd like to remind the committee what we have right now is a few minutes set aside. If there's any sort of specific, mostly like clarifying questions at this point for Kelly, otherwise we can move on and we will have a broader discussion with all of the sponsors in just a bit. Does anyone have any clarifying comments or questions? I'm looking online as well. I don't see any hands up. Okay, so stay tuned, Kelly, for the broader discussion. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to our colleagues from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Also joining us virtually is going to be Dan Barry, David Benson, and Anna Rita Mariotti. And I believe, yes, Dan, you're going to be giving the presentation. Good to see you, Dan. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim. Can you see me, hear me, and see the slides?
Yes, all is well. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm gonna be giving the presentation for NOAA, but my colleagues are online and can also participate in the discussion session. So first of all, extending Kelly's thanks to the NAS for organizing this study and the committee members for performing this service. It's, as Kelly said, an important area of research. It's an important potential service area for the country, for the world to provide these kind of attribution statements and help communities understand extreme events better and thus prepare for them better. And many thanks for the invite to present. These are the three current high-level NOAA goals. The first one is to understand and predict changes in climate, weather, oceans, and coasts. The second is to share that knowledge and information with others. And the third is to conserve and manage coastal and marine ecosystems and resources. And understanding climate trends, understanding extreme events is of course, very important to all of these goals. And there are a number of ways in which attribution, extreme event research is performed and integrates into the breadth of NOAA's mission. I'm going to go through some of that in this talk today. NOAA has a rich history of evaluating extreme events, analyzing them, producing products for the public to help understand extreme events, doing attribution studies of droughts, for example, the Louisiana floods. That study in particular was done in collaboration between GFDL, our modeling center at NOAA, the World Weather Attribution Activity and Climate Central. And then, of course, we're a repository of immense amounts of observational data, modeling data, and various studies. We also have a unique role in the National Climate Assessment. This is a major stakeholder for analyses of extreme events. There are case studies throughout the National Climate Assessment of domestic events and trying to extract learning to build resilience, to develop adaptation strategies from those events. So a rich set of activities and capabilities at NOAA relevant to this area. And beyond that, we are looked to by the public to provide intelligence about these events. When they happen, we, of course, initially get lots of calls from media about the causes of these events. But also we have a really large service capability and activity at NOAA through our weather forecast offices, our regional climate centers, our regional climate service directors, and a number of other capabilities. And our communities are really curious about why these events are happening, whether we were able to predict them and warn the public adequately, and then whether these types of events are changing over time. At NOAA, we have, of course, a very robust activity to do formal operational prediction on seasonal and shorter timescales through our National Weather Service. On longer timescales, we have many activities that are looking at predictions years, decades, and multiple decades into the future to help prepare society. On those longer timescales, those activities are a little bit less firmly organized or concretized in the agency. So one of the things that we're trying to do in a number of ways is to organize ourselves on these longer timescales to bring together our scientists, our operational capabilities, our technical capabilities across the agency to deliver this longer range information with more of a service architecture that we employ so successfully at shorter timescales. The report that Jim alluded to in his opening comments was very instrumental in recent activity over the last few years at NOAA. So I want to touch on some of the things we've invested in and the directions that we're going in. The report contained, quite a bit of useful perspective on gaps in the science and research and the basis for performing evaluations of extreme events. It also evaluated a lot of technological gaps, particularly gaps in the observational data sets that are used to undergird these analyses, particularly, as I recall, the descriptions of decadal variability and how that influences extreme events. We at NOAA are interested in a couple of primary drivers here based out of this report. The first of which is really trying to bring the agency together, as I mentioned, across our different components, our different line offices, our different research laboratories, so that we have some basis for consistent and shared understanding of events, their causes, and an ability to then communicate in more of an enterprise fashion about these events. And in addition, to develop products and services around the communication about causes of extreme events for public consumption. So a goal to get there is to develop something that's transparent and reproducible, a method, a process at the agency to bring our scientists together through pseudo-operational activities and use well-documented methods and approaches to performing analyses of extreme events after they happen. We have a funding effort that we launched in fiscal year 2020. This was led by the Climate Program Office, which is where I'm located in NOAA. It's in our research line office, the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. It involved 4 different programs that represent different aspects of climate research across NOAA and the Climate Program Office. And it was focused on explaining extreme events, climate attribution at some level, but also a number of other aspects of this that are highly relevant to the agency's mission. So first of all, these programs are very interested in understanding the causes of extreme events, their phenomenology, of course, the contributions of natural variability and synoptic variability, et cetera, and anthropogenic forcing of these events. Predictability and prediction skill are very crucial aspects of understanding extremes at NOAA, given that we have a significant prediction capability and mandate. Evaluating the skill of our models and the fit for purpose of our observational data sets is crucial, and that's part of this activity as well. Developing products that are useful for our boundary spanners in the agency and the communities that we work with and for is another crucial aspect of this. And then finally, developing this organized capability. One of the things that we've thought about, and this is a graphic that was adapted from the prior National Academy's report, where it looked at essentially the scientific basis for understanding, contextualizing, and performing attribution for different types of meteorological phenomena, is that we want to move all of these circles up and to the right ultimately through our scientific enterprise. We'd like to increase our knowledge, our capability to simulate these events and contextualize them in observations and the historical record in a way that can enable more firm and lower uncertainty statements about what's behind these events, their drivers, how they might be changing over time. So one of our goals is to invest in that science and try to move these circles up and to the right on this graphic. The other one is again, as I mentioned, creating this investment to try to bring things together across the agency. So we funded a couple types of projects. This first group of projects is focused more on the traditional research along different lines of extreme events and trying to understand their behavior and their drivers, model fidelity, the kind of issues that I talked about on the last slide. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I wanted to kind of read this into the record for the committee, some of these folks and projects that you might want to look into a little bit more as you go about this study process. But the major investment in this funding initiative was funding a large core internal project to bring together different pieces of the agency. In this project, we have the National Centers for Environmental Information serving as the service lead for this activity, trying to develop ways in which we can perform routine analyses of extreme events, but then also creating connectivity with scientists across the agency at laboratories in our operational centers like the Climate Prediction Center and the Weather Service to bring all of these different elements of diverse knowledge, capabilities, analytical perspectives, bringing the information back into our operational services around seasonal prediction. So this team is really trying to bring things together across the agency and create kind of common approaches and understanding of these events. The team published a paper in BAMS a couple years ago that focused on the process that they proposed to perform this type of routine evaluation at NOAA. Initially, they're focused on drought events and heat waves for a couple reasons. First of all, because the NAS report in 2016 identified those two particular types of phenomena and extreme phenomena as having a solid scientific basis for attribution and analysis. But then also because we have pre-existing strong workflows and enterprise activities at NOAA on drought and on extreme heat through NIDIS and NIHIS and our partnerships with other agencies. Finally, a few scattered thoughts about the things that we're hoping for from this study. And I agree with Kelly. I think the work plan and the layout is fantastic. A lot of these bullet points are already reflected in what you've said you're going to cover. But I think there are also some other things to think about here in terms of framing and other topics that would be great to see reflected in the study that's produced ultimately. The first one is regarding needing a more organized or systematic approach to attribution. Now that the science, the techniques are more mature than they were in 2016 in that evaluation, what would that look like? And how would we collaborate across the federal, the private, and the academic sectors to produce these kind of analyses? This is a really important point, I think, which is what the use case is for these studies. So, today and over the course of your study, there are going to be a lot of different approaches shared, some of which are performed before an event even happens, some of which are performed during the event, after the event, and then for NOAA's effort, probably weeks to months after the event to kind of do a deeper analysis and then relay that to our boundary spanners and regional organizations. And something that it would be great to see that the 2016 report did not cover as much is how are these studies being used? How do they interact with societal understanding of climate change and extreme events? What role do they play in contributing to adaptation? And how does the timing, frequency, speed, breadth, depth, process versus statistical approaches, how do those interact with public understanding and generate useful information? The knowledge basis, it would be great to see a reassessment of that. Have we made any progress over the last decade in advancing the knowledge of particular types of events and their causes and the types of extremes? So the report was very focused on physical extremes, but also thinking about biological, ecological extremes, cascading extremes where you may have simultaneous or concurrent events that happen. And then other dimensions of extremes, so not just about the physical impacts, but also the way in which those are experienced through exposure and vulnerability of society. Modeling capabilities, if they're fit to purpose, predictability, we would love to get an update from the committee on the state of the art in predictability and where there are significant gaps, research gaps that need to be filled. Same with observational gaps, if there have been any advances that the committee sees over the last decade that have addressed some of those issues previously identified. The processes undergirding these events and whether we need investments like field campaigns or intensive observational periods to try to better understand some of the particular types of events. And then finally, service outcomes. And this was also an aspect that was not covered in detail in the prior report, but thinking about what types of products, again, that we're trying to provide to society and how those products can be used most effectively to increase resilience to climate and weather events. A final slide, just giving you a little directory of folks at CPO and in other parts of NOAA who are involved. I really hope at some point over the course of the study that the team that we funded might be able to speak to the committee about their activity. And that team's led by Dave Easterling, and Zach Labe is the rep from GFDL, and Joe Barsugli from the Physical Sciences Laboratory in Ceres out in Colorado. So thanks, Jim, for the opportunity to present.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that very nice presentation and the slides. Very, very useful for the committee's deliberations. Again, if we have any clarifying questions at this point for Dan, Grace.
Dan, thank you so much for your great leadership on NOAA's effort on the attribution of extreme weather and climate events. I think it is always exciting to see how research findings can be used to mitigate the impact of extreme weather on vulnerable communities. And you did mention one motivation of NOAA's effort is to provide clear services and products to reduce the impact on the vulnerable communities. So if they have already happened, could you please give us a couple examples if they haven't happened yet? So what are the expectations from NOAA? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Grace, for the comments and the question. So the team that's focused on developing the capability, this is still very much in an R&D phase. The project is coming to a conclusion over the next year. And what they've been focused on, which is detailed in the BAMS paper that I shared, is the kind of background work, assembling the data sets, developing the protocol that would be used and repeated across different extreme events, thinking about how the approach might differ depending upon the type of meteorological extreme that they're considering. And then creating a lot of the social infrastructure, which is a probably underlooked but really key aspect of this, especially at an agency that's as widely distributed in climate expertise as NOAA is. So they have done experimental or kind of test cases. So they looked, for example, at the Texas heat wave a couple of summers ago, I believe, as a case study for trying to exercise the observational data sets, the modeling approaches that they're proposing to use. That was not disseminated publicly. We're going through a process of working through that report with some of the stakeholders and boundary spanners that NOAA has in that region, for example, the Regional Climate Service directors, but also representatives from the National Integrated Heat Health Information System as well, who are interested in using that type of a study with the stakeholders that they work with. Something that we hear frequently from our individuals who are out providing service in conversation with communities is that they really do feel that there's this unfilled gap after an event happens in being able to adequately and confidently describe the nature of that event, the pathways that led to that event's occurrence, and then thinking about, not only infrastructure investment that's appropriate to being more resilient to that event in the future, but thinking about shorter timescale issues like improved weather forecasts, improved climate forecasts, so that at the shorter timescales we can really focus on more immediate efforts to protect lives and property. And so, another set of folks that you might want to consider talking to from NOAA are our regional climate service directors, like Ellen McCrae in the Northeast, for example, who is very deeply in conversation with these type of communities and has communicated to me and others at NOAA the need for this type of information. And I don't know if they have the ability to unmute and talk, but I did notice that I think David Easterling is online. Also, again, my colleagues Anna-Rita Mariotti and David, if they wanted to provide any additional perspective on that. But Grace, hopefully that's somewhat addressing your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Tanisha, I see you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much, Dan. Wondered if you could speak a little to some of the criteria you use to identify the events for which you explore attribution around. What triggers the studies?
That's a good question. I would defer that to the team that's performing the studies. I think that would be a great thing to explore with them. There's a lot of deep thinking that they've done about the triggers, about how they define, whether an event rises to the threshold of something that they want to actually go in and perform an evaluation of. I will say, part of it is like the National Centers for Environmental Information. They are thinking about these kind of combined effects of both the physical vulnerability and the straight physical impacts of the event. So the product $1 billion disasters, for example, is one way in which that's integrated, where we're looking at the economic costs of these events and factoring in both the fact that the meteorology driving those events is changing, but so is the cost of our insured infrastructure that's exposed to the events. But I think that's a great topic that I can't go into too much detail on. It's certainly something the team has thought quite a bit about. Again, I don't know if Dave Easterling is able to access, speaking privileges on the call or not, but it's something he might be able to provide more information on either today or at a future meeting when hopefully the committee would invite that team to talk.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
Thanks for the question.
Like I said, we are going to have more information gathering sessions. Anna Rita and David Benson can have access right now, but we're limited it to those individuals. Deputy, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for the presentation. I just had a quick question about the scope of the work that you all are doing. Is the intention to build this up like capability for attribution for events that affect the US and North America, or are you all thinking of something that is maybe more broader in scope and can also serve the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly, we all appreciate the need for this type of service at a global scale. And I think Kelly covered that as well in talking about the significant observational gaps in parts of the world, which are a huge issue in doing these types of analyses. We don't at the moment have a strong mission directive or driver to do this outside of the United States, although this work would include the contiguous United States, the outlying islands, Alaska, and then the Caribbean. I've talked a little bit to folks at Environment Climate Change Canada about the possibility of collaboration with them on some of this work, but that's something that's probably pretty far off to at least extend it more into a holistic North American framework. But no, we don't have plans to perform attribution studies of events that happen abroad, unfortunately, although certainly recognize that that those events need study.
All right, thank you, Dan. I think at this point, I'd like to move on to Anjali Bamzai from the National Science Foundation. And again, remind the committee that we have opportunity after Anjali's presentation to engage all of the sponsors in some of these broader questions. So Anjali, thank you so much for joining us and for coming in person.
I love coming in person. I like seeing the committee, etc. So thanks, Rachel, for adjusting my, little space for me. Yeah, Dan mentioned Dave Easterling. So I want to just backtrack and say, not speaking for NSF here, but when I was in DOE, we had an international detection and attribution working group. And the NOAA side of things, we had a program, they've since gone, Chris Miller was running the program, but we knew that NOAA had these long-term observational records, and DOE had, strength in global modeling. And so we wanted to bring the modelers and confront them for detection and attribution, detection of the heat waves, Chicago heat wave set it off, like they were doing global modeling studies. I think Jerry Meal did them, and with different forcing and trying to see how way off the models were from the observations, etc. And then the European heat wave 2003, I think Randy Dole studied that 2005. Anyway, in the beginning, just the detection and attribution studies were more focused on temperature, because we knew that with carbon dioxide emissions, well, we're going to get warming temperatures. How is that going to impact certain climate extremes? Now, the 2016 study, in fact, I was just seeing the committee, and some Francis Wyers and Gabi Hergil were on that committee, and they were part of the IDAG, just so that you guys have a sense of history about the whole thing. So 2016, we were still not confident about precipitation extremes, etc., doing a robust attribution for that. But since then, our knowledge has kept expanding, and we have more basis to do attribution for extremes other than the climate extremes. So I just want to provide those remarks of, they're not necessarily NSF. Now, speaking with my NSF hat, I'm Senior Science Advisor for Global Climate Change in the Geosciences Directorate. And my colleagues in atmospheric and geospace sciences could not join you today, so I'm filling in for them. So in AGS, as well as in the ocean sciences and in earth sciences, there's a lot of substantial portfolio on looking at extremes, hydrological extremes. Wildfires has become a big deal, studying wildfires and the causes for that, attributing that. I know that in the Hawaii wildfires in the beginning, they were even connecting it to El Nino, but then later on, there have been some studies that there was a flash drought, soil moisture, and then the native species. Long and short being, there's a lot of projects that are being done across the horizon of Earth system science at NSF on the attribution of extremes. So what are we looking for in this study? So NSF is, we have a mission to promote the progress of science and engineering and advance national health, prosperity, and welfare. So within that broad mission, certainly attribution of this event attribution is very important. Not only does it serve to push the boundaries of science and what we understand about the system, but also in terms of opportunities for outreach when there is an event taking place. If, in the beginning, we weren't that interested in the 2016 timeframe. I remember we weren't that interested in the real-time attribution, like as much as perhaps our those agencies that have an operational mission, because they want to know immediately, is this a storm within 100 years or 1,000 years? And we were thinking, well, we can be more deliberate and take time and have a good study, which is peer-reviewed, etc. But now we see that the intensity, frequency, duration is kind of increasing in some of these events. So we also feel that there's an imperative to understand attribution in a more timely way. So that's one of the things. I really like the objectives that you've laid out. There wasn't much that I could cover in terms of adding on anything that was missing, except to say that perhaps that what about the cascading? Like, if you have one event, and then it has a cascading. For example, if you have rainfall, then there's increased incident of landslide, actually wildfires. There have been some studies that we've had in the California wildfires, that after the wildfires, there was increased incidence of landslides and damage, etc. So in the end, it's all about society and the impacts they feel, and how can that better inform in terms of design, engineering design, etc. So these are the main interests that NSF would have. We, as you are aware, we have the disciplinary programs, so-called disciplinary programs, and then there are the interdisciplinary initiatives. So these studies actually that the Academy does are, we pay a lot of attention to them, and they shape and mold the, solicitations that may be forthcoming. So with that, I'll turn it back, and I'm sorry I didn't make as slick a presentation as Dan. I can send some of, if you're interested, I can draw up who are PIs. I see some of them in the room actually, so who've been funded by the agency dealing with extremes.
Thank you very much, Anjali. And I can assure you that cascading events are on the minds of the committee. So we are thinking about that very much so. Again, open it up to the committee members for comments specific to Anjali at this point. The lesson seems to be if you show slides, Dan, you get a lot more questions than if you just make
I'm learning
remarks. So keep that in mind. Okay, so we have just under an hour. We have about 55 minutes now. I know in preparing for this open session, the committee, we have a really great committee, a lot of strategic thinkers coming from diverse backgrounds and disciplines. And we identified a number of questions that we thought would be of interest to raise this afternoon. in this initial discussion with the sponsors, with some of the sponsors of this study. So I'm going to look to my colleagues on the committee to not be shy, like we talked about this morning. If you have a question entered in or another one that has come to mind after hearing these three presentations, this is now our opportunity to kind of ask these questions for a general discussion with all of the sponsors that are represented here.
I did have an afterthought, yeah, because Bezos Earth Fund is also funding the study. I just wanted to inform you all that we are actually co-funding another study, the Roundtable on Macroeconomy and Climate, with the Bezos Earth Fund. So we're really pleased that, you know, some of these emerging R&D topics, what should we be doing now? And at least NSF can be viewed as more a seed corn agency. So what we want to do now that will yield the results, say 3 to 5 years from now. I know we don't have time to waste, but just to the extent possible, a little bit longer term thinking.
And then may I follow up this comment? So I want to ask each and every one of our fantastic speakers. So in your organization, how do you envision the change in research priorities in the next 5 years? Thank you.
You mean based on this study, right?
Yeah, related to the attribution of extreme weather and climate events and their impacts.
Yes, in a way, actually, when we join as observers in the study and in the workshop topics and all, that is an educational experience for the program officers at NSF, because they may not necessarily be aware of something that's happening in another agency or funded out of philanthropy, etc. So in a way, what impact does it have on the solicitations? They do shape our solicitations, because sometimes we may make a connection with partners if there are mutual interests in, you know, co-funding things across. So that's one way. In NSF, there's a lot of thing. The other thing I didn't mention is the Technology Innovation and Partnership Directorate, which is new and which is much more downstream. So it's translational research. So in your study, if there was something that was there, you know, that's something to keep in mind. In addition to event attribution from a purely methodological and you know, knowledge-based thing, but if there was some impacts and there's you know, further downstream translational research for the benefit of society, that will certainly shape. And I'm sure that my colleagues in the TIP Directorate, I mean, I'll alert them to this study. They will participate in your workshops. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. Dan or Kelly, I know, Dan, in your presentation, you clearly gave some indications of the influence of the 2016 report on some of the NOAA priorities moving forward. Any thoughts about the next few years, what that holds maybe as an outcome of this report?
Yeah, I anticipate that this report, of course, would be very valuable to our programs in the way that the prior report was. This is a research area, as I tried to articulate, that's key to a variety of different aspects of NOAA's mission. And so it's a research area that I would anticipate multiple programs would be interested in continuing to resource. The R&D project that I alluded to that's led by NCEI with collaborators, that project is coming to an end. The initial, you know, investment in that project, we're going to internally review that project over the next, hopefully, few months. To think about, you know, where that team has gotten to think about the potential for a transition of that project into a sustained, more base activity potentially. So part of what that group is doing is thinking about how to create highly efficient methods for producing these kind of studies in, you know, a number of weeks or months after the events happen. And so I think we're at this juncture now considering how this activity would live on in a more durable or in a service context at NOAA in a sustained manner. And I think, if that activity does transition in such a fashion, that'll be a very strong mission research driver for continued investments in improving that capability, investing in the science to increase the basis for doing attribution outside of the drought and heat events, as I articulated in my slides. And continuing to improve our modeling systems for the modeling and observational systems for the purpose of producing these kind of studies. Another thing that I would highlight is on the industrial side, where we're also making investments in projection services, climate projection services, also centered with NCEI as the service lead. And we're very interested in many of the same types of linkages that Anjali mentioned. We're working quite a bit with the engineering industry through the American Society of Civil Engineers at NOAA. That organization has asked NOAA to produce projection data to inform the next generation of building codes and standards. This will be the first time they've taken non-stationarity into account in setting building codes and standards, which these standards determine all of the local codes that are used to enforce, and make sure that engineered structures are durable and can stand up to many different impacts, including meteorological and climate impacts. And we're seeing a lot of industrial interest in these kind of studies. In fact, one of the images I put on my slides was a paper that was co-written between NOAA scientists and the American Society of Civil Engineers, arguing for attribution as a kind of mode of analysis and learning that's complementary to forward-looking projection data. And I think that's something that inspires our investment in this in a complementary way to the climate projection investments. And is also a topic, as I mentioned, that it would be really wonderful for the committee to reflect on the way in which these different styles of packaging analyses and information work differently in terms of the way they're uptaken by communities that are responsible for building resilience to climate and weather impacts. So those are a few thoughts. I think this report will be, very influential on these investments and also the agency's thinking about trying to have a durable analytical capability in this area.
And I guess just to come in, I mean, for philanthropy, I think this will be incredibly helpful for when you guys identify the greatest research gaps. This is somewhere that hopefully we can help support to the extent that there aren't other sources of funding for that. I think that's been the case already, especially with the last NSF, the last National Academies report. And I think that some of the related communications work would be of great interest to philanthropy as well. I think we also would be interested to see how this work impacts some of our other portfolios of work. For example, we have a grand challenge on AI for climate and nature that we recently launched, and the intersections between this work and some of the AI developments could be very interesting to explore. And I could see that pertaining to other bodies of work as well. Obviously, for those working in the resilience space, I think this will greatly inform the work as well. So we, at the Earth Fund, and I think many others in philanthropy are guided by our goals, which in the case of us are addressing nature loss and the climate crisis, but also kind of the latest research in terms of what does that tell us in terms of meaningful interventions. So this is going to be quite impactful, I think, for the whole world as well. I mean, this is just a very cutting edge science and discovery.
Thank you, Anjali, Dan, and Kelly, for those answers to that question. I see the committee has some additional questions. Tanisha?
Thanks, Chair. So we heard from Noah earlier with respect to data and possibilities of future interventions internationally and the constraints there. But we wondered for other sponsors, how might the study outcomes or recommendations in relation to data sparse regions or regions that will be underrepresented in the attribution science discourse? How might the study outcomes and recommendations influence your future initiatives or interventions?
I mean, I could start there. I think there are a few different aspects of this. One is, I think we already are supporting, for example, in the case of both Climate Central work and World Weather Attribution work, global work that also covers data sparse regions, and I think can continue to do so, right? Especially as the methods advance for contending with areas that don't have a lot of data. I think the other question is, will there be interventions to deal with the data gaps themselves in addition to the science on extreme weather attribution? And here, you know, as I was mentioning with the AI Grand Challenge, there is a large push in the community to see, for example, how AI might be able to be used to contend with some of the data gaps. And are we going to see some tremendous movement over the next few years there? And that's an area that we're watching quite closely. So this will be of great interest for us at the Bezos Earth Fund. We're global philanthropy and certainly interested in ensuring that this science is advanced globally. So you can count us in on that.
NSF has an Office of International Science and Engineering, and we have a lot of bilaterals with various countries, and to enable the researchers from coming together to gather. It's possible that some scientists in the African continent would have long-term data sets, and then they can collaborate. In fact, I've funded something like that. Sharon Nicholson used to work from Florida State, used to work, and she had some connections. That was all temperature data, so constructing the records. So if you talk about data gaps, yes, we have projects like that. Also, if there are some phenomena that we need to study that may be outside the US, you know, and that's fine. We know that nature has no boundaries, and, you know, phenomena don't respect national boundaries. And so we have to collect the field data or so we have field campaigns also. But for attribution, the thing I could think about was if we have an extreme event, for example, the like of Sandy, then we do have a mechanism in place at NSF where researchers can go and collect that data immediately. Like they need to collect the observational data in a timely manner. It's not going to wait. So for example, when Sandy occurred, there was sediments data that oceanographers could collect sediments to place the flood in once in 100, once in 1,000, they could quantify it. So we have those kind of mechanisms, and I don't believe that those rapid, it's called rapid, that's not restricted only to within the US. It could be anywhere, but it's just getting that data and you know, just moving the system fast enough to have the researcher go there and collect the data. So we're not restricted in terms of boundaries. Having said that, most of the funding does go to the US-based researchers, but in exceptional cases when the case can be made that we need that expertise for this project, you know, that happens too. We may fund. And then I want to say that we have the Belmont Forum as well, which is a whole different funding where a lot of funding agencies pool their resources, and most of it is sustainability. I'm not sure event attribution is there. I don't think so. Their recent call is organizing around Africa. I know that. And so, yeah, the African the call that's out right now, but it may not be for event attribution per se.
Thank you. And Dan, you've already addressed this, but anything to add, or are you good?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing on this question. So, although, as I said earlier, in response to the question, Tanisha, that events that happen abroad are, not events that we would be able to do analogous attribution studies of to the ones that we're trying to prepare for the US and outlying territories. One of the components of the effort at NOAA is, again, to understand the predictability of events and the context for events, particularly the natural variability drivers of events. And a lot of that information is supplied by the Climate Prediction Center at NOAA. Those analyses are global in nature, and the Climate Prediction Center also does have a pretty strong investment in an international desk that focuses on providing forecast products and working with international stakeholders and colleagues to provide information. And so, the way in which that aspect of the attribution effort develops could potentially offer some opportunities for providing at least some degree of context around events abroad, perhaps working with other partners who do have it in their mission to do more focused studies of particular extreme events. So that might be an area of collaboration that NOAA could engage in terms of thinking about international resilience and events that happen in places where there's not as much knowledge about predictability or where operational prediction systems are not as readily available.
Thanks, Khalid.
Great, thank you. James.
Yeah, thanks to the sponsors for their overviews. I was interested in understanding the climate change challenges that are maybe common across your major stakeholder groups. So the reason I'm asking is I'm trying to understand the science advances that would have the broadest applicability rather than being specific to a specific sector of society. I wondered if anyone could comment on that.
Could you elaborate a little bit on climate challenges?
Well, for example, water managers in California are interested in this weather whiplash, swings between wet years and dry years, whereas agriculture might have other challenges with sustained drought, for example. So I was just wondering what future scientific advances would be of value across multiple stakeholder groups.
By stakeholder, you mean funding agencies, James?
I was thinking broader than that. So
Broader than that,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
yeah. Because on the former, it would like each one of us may be having common interests, but we may be a little bit distinct as well. For example, NSF might be willing to do a little bit more high risk, high risk, high impact. Like if we think that this particular avenue of research might yield something that would really be good if it was successful, but we're willing to fail. We may be a little more high risk, high impact, and NOAA might be looking at something which they can pass down, so there may be some slight differences. But having said that, I think temperature related attribution is relatively mature. And so I would think that pushing the boundaries on things that are less well understood would be NSF's interest. We'd be interested in unveiling all that. But it's not like temperature is not important, but I'm just saying, yeah, pushing it might be a little bit more in our bailiwick.
I guess to just come in on that, I think the challenge and the huge opportunity is that you are going to be speaking to a very broad user group. It's actually, I would argue it's not us that matters. It's more who's going to read this report and how to design this report so that it's relevant to multiple users. I think just for the funder community, obviously, I think you're outlining the major research priorities and gaps is going to be quite helpful. It's kind of a roadmap for how to advance this work even further. But there's also going to be a need in terms of communication of, what kind of statements can meteorologists say with what certainty to ensure accuracy. There are going to be those that are in the resilience field at a local level, at a global level, who are advancing work in being able to speak to them as well. I think that presents a challenge, but it's also going to be important to see. And maybe these are kind of follow-up communication products after the report is done that speaks to a variety of these different audiences with kind of interviews to see what is top of mind for them and what kind of guidance would be most helpful. But you're going to have such a wealth of information that could be useful to so many different types of practitioners, the research community, the funding community, that it would be a shame not to kind of pull out all the stops on reaching all of them.
Thank you, Kelly. Dan?
Yeah, I think Kelly said a lot of it, but thinking about the research needs, they're pretty similar across, I think, all of the sort of impact spaces, industrial spaces. At NOAA, we're seeing requests and demand for information from everywhere. So every type of stakeholder is interested. I mean, you mentioned water managers. We have a rich activity at NOAA with USDA, Department of Interior, and then state and local water authorities. Those communities are very sophisticated. They know directly how to go read a seasonal forecast or a subseasonal forecast and make highly attuned decisions on their water management strategies, releases, storing up water during dry periods, et cetera. And their knowledge of the types of research gaps and advances they want to see are much more advanced. There are other communities that are more novel, that are newer to consuming this kind of information and integrating that into resilience. As Kelly mentioned, co-production is a really important aspect of this, trying to identify upfront in the process the types of specific needs and questions that the consumers of the ultimate information have. That's something we've been trying to kind of model in practice in the attribution work we're doing, where we're really trying to understand from our boundary spanners or people who are talking to the industrial stakeholders, the practitioners, the nature of the information, the way to present it, the exact type of questions that they're wondering about. They differ by group, they differ by industrial segment, and so having that kind of consultative capability is really important, and centering a conversation throughout the production process is really important. I think a lot of our programs across the federal government have learned this, like the CAP program at NOAA or the climate centers, the climate hubs in USDA and other agencies. But I could just go through a list of all of the industries, basically just go down all the chapters of the National Climate Assessment, and they're all knocking on the door. They're looking for information. They want it to be reliable. They want it to meet very high information quality standards. They want to know that the methods, the data sets are reliable and trustworthy, and they want products that are going to integrate well into their decision-making context. Working with the American Society of Civil Engineers has been a real pleasure, because one thing they've done is they've really reduced our question about, for example, climate forcing scenarios. They've just told us we would like 3-degree projections of wind risk, flooding risk, precip risk, and thermal risk. And that has been really wonderful, because that's a very sophisticated, numerically experienced community, but it really varies by the context.
Great, thank you. Jen?
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. My question is also along the lines of the impacts, and I'm just curious about the perceptions of your organizations about the scope, because of course we have the direct impacts or the direct attribution links, temperature related or precipitation related on the events themselves. And of course, all of these different types of events have direct impacts on different aspects of society, on economic damages, public health impacts from heat waves and so on. And I'm just wondering about, what are the, and they get more complicated, the modeling gets more complicated, the attribution chains get more complicated as you go on to supply chains and things like that. And so what is the scope are you thinking, or do you see this as just, you know, as the modeling and studies get more sophisticated, this is where we're pushing the boundaries? Or do you have kind of a clearly defined scope of impacts in your mind, or how do you view this scope of those impacts, I guess?
I would hope that the experts would, within the charge, define the whole thing. Having said that, what we'd be interested in is knowing what are the pressure points, where are the bottlenecks that, you know, if we could just resolve this part of it, we would be able to move ahead. And so the eventual aspirational goal is, of course, to minimize damage to property and save lives due to these extremes. And, you know, we think that better understanding and attribution would lead to that. So I would hesitate to completely, I mean, if the scope is if the pressure point is beyond something that we are doing, we would like to hear that. Like if this is what we need to be, who the climate scientists need to be working with the engineers and somebody else, then we would like to hear that, yeah, if we're not doing something. So I would say that identifying the bottlenecks would be useful for us.
Yeah, I think similarly, it would be interesting for the science to kind of dictate the scope. How far can the science go? Where does it get, as you said, incredibly complex? What are the greatest uncertainties? What are the unlocks there? Instead of defining that scope, though I realize it can lead into scope creep, obviously, but it would be very interesting to just know kind of how advanced our ability is when it comes to impacts, in what areas, what are the areas that would require a lot more further methodological development, et cetera. Yeah, I would hope that the study could cover that.
And also missed opportunities. If you're missing something, you know, sometimes you're only looking under the light because that's the light. But are we missing? So hopefully, you know, your collective body would tell us if we are missing some opportunities. We would like to hear that as well.
Your question's really evergreen in a mission agency of how far to go down the value chain. I think that I don't know if this is like an agency statement, but my perception is that the comfort level with going a little bit farther down the value chain is increasing to some extent, with the recognition that if we don't extend ourselves a little bit more into the practice space, there's going to continue to be this really significant gap of uptake of information. But we can't start at NOAA building wind risk models. We don't have the capability, nor do we have the mission driver to do that. So we have to partner with other federal agencies in that space, like NIST, private sector, and academic researchers who can collaborate on that type of activity. But for me as a program manager, it's something that I've been grappling with quite a bit over the last 2 or 3 years, where we want to see the work that we're funding and trying to do as an agency be uptaken successfully. And often that requires going a little bit further than we may have in the past into that application space. And some of those methods, or supporting some of those methods as part of funded research, than we perhaps may have in the past, where we just stopped completely at the physical climate limitation. But part of that also can be really, as we said before, clearly defining the questions and the context up front, and ensuring that at the very least the physical climate information is well attuned to the way in which it's going to be integrated with other methods in the industrial or practitioner context later.
Great, thank you very much. I see, Kevin, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you to each of our presenters so far today. My question is, going back, our statement of task, one of the key things we have to do is assess current capabilities for attribution of impacts. So I just kind of have one of those deceptively simple questions for you, but what does impacts mean to you and your organization in the context of extreme weather and attribution? And then along with that, are there areas in which you perceive that research is growing or that research needs to grow with regards to helping us understand what kind of impacts should be central to this field moving forward?
Well, impacts could be economic impacts. So, you know, you have the disasters map that NOAA puts out, which is some kind of baseline about $1 billion. And so I would think that that would be some guiding force in terms of which events need attention, either by this committee or in general. Impacts could be impacts on, you know, human lives, property, etc. So yeah, basically, I guess the economic one is the final integrator of all that that's in that map. So I'm not sure what else to say. Yeah, so impacts on social communities and disproportionate impacts is another thing. We know that some of these extremes are having a disproportionate impact. So untangling that bit also would be useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I would pick up on what Anjali said, and something that was really vivid in the last National Climate Assessment were some of the analyses that integrated the physical impacts with data sets and context around the equity of vulnerability. For example, there's a figure that's really burned into my brain at this point that showed the incredible difference in projected vulnerability to flooding based on the percentage of census tracts, the percentage of Black population in census tracts. And there are economic dimensions, racial dimensions, a variety of different equity dimensions to that. And I think that if we're going to couple this kind of understanding with effective adaptive action and resilience building, that contextualizing that understanding is really important along those dimensions as well.
Yeah, I agree with my previous two colleagues. I think it would be interesting just to look broadly and see where the science is for each type of these impacts, right? How far can it go? How mature are the methods? Where are the greatest uncertainties, et cetera? I think that would actually, to do a systematic review, could be quite informative.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other hands up at the moment, so I'm going, oh, okay. Well, I was just going to ask, we've touched on this a little bit, and maybe a bit of a two-part question. And it's just something that has come up in our committee deliberations to this date. Just pointing out that the previous event focused on a specific subset of extreme events, if you will. I guess in particular, maybe it's useful to name them extreme heat, extreme cold, drought, extreme rainfall, extreme snow, tropical cyclones, extratropical cyclones, wildfire, and severe convective storms, with varying degrees of what we could say about those particular events back in 2016. So I know it's within the purview of the committee to, sort of, design the report and think if there's other, certain kinds of extreme events. We've already talked, Anjali, about cascading events and things like that. Just wondered if on the minds of the sponsors, if there's any other kind of extreme events in particular that you would like to see this committee address or think about as part one.
Yeah. So one of the things I kind of snuck into my slide set was, and this is in a particular NOAA context, thinking about our management activities for fisheries and our national marine sanctuaries and coastal environments, is the way in which those physical impacts cascade into biological and ecological systems. So there can be quite a bit of coupling between the biogeochemistry, for example, in the coastal environment and the physical oceanography and coupled climate behavior in those systems that reinforce each other and have huge effects on, in the NOAA case, fisheries, then significant economic effects that cascade. So perhaps thinking about the extension into biological or ecological systems could be one dimension to think about beyond the physical effects, but I'm not aware of like other categories of physical meteorological phenomena that would be that I'd want to see. I think perhaps bringing out marine heat waves as an explicit topic, diverse from terrestrial heat waves, because those are two very different types of phenomena. And actually, there's been a lot of thinking on how to baseline marine heat waves that might be useful for thinking about the baselining of other types of more terrestrial or atmospheric extreme events that could be useful. So those are a couple thoughts.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, there's certainly a growing body of literature on marine heat waves, so that's a good suggestion. Angeli or Kelly, anything on this? Angeli?
Yeah, so I think when we started off this entire enterprise, like decades ago, it was the global and attribution of the global with multiple forcings. I'm just thinking of Warren Washington, who just passed away, and he was doing all those experiments. And then we gotten to regional phenomena, so drought over a particular area, and then attributing that. And then more recently, there have been local severe storms. And so there's some interesting work coming out of tornado, the hail size. I think Victor Gensini's work, I saw it published in Nature Climate a month or so ago, on the size of hail. And so looking at it historically, et cetera, and trying to do some kind of attribution. And so, I think the jury's still out, but those are the kind of findings that, you're even going to a smaller spatial sort of region and trying to see something happening there. And I want to say tornadoes, but no, whatever I heard at the local storm was that no, tornadoes, there's no connection with heating. But on the reverse, like the hail size, there are some theoretical arguments that can be made about the water carrying capacity of the atmosphere, et cetera. So yeah, those would be the kind of new directions that, and you didn't even talk about space weather. I'm assuming that that's out. That's not within the scope of this study. We were looking where humans live and where, not that space weather events don't impact us, but, we're looking at the lower atmosphere, right, June?
Well, yeah, I would attribute space weather events to the sun myself, but no.
But as it
certainly impacts, yeah.
But as it comes down, the
Yeah,
stratosphere, tropospheric, those sub-seasonal type of, but anyway, yeah, it's good to scope it that way, and keep that out. But I would think that, there are some tantalizing results that are coming in the literature, and it's not yet completely settled, but who knows? Yeah, as we learn more about the system, as we collect more historical data, we can place these events that we see in the context of what happened. Yeah. And I don't know whether you're doing paleo, I guess not.
I'll come to paleo in a second. Kelly, did you have anything on that?
No, thanks. The only other thing that I would add is it probably would be helpful for the kind of more general audience to be also talking about timescales as well, in terms of the kind of daily extremes that sometimes are not as top of mind as these kind of very large scale singular events, and are, nonetheless important to talk about. So providing a framework for understanding of that could be quite helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much. And sort of in that direction, maybe even the paleo direction, just to share the committee, again, today is really day one for the committee to get together, and we just had a little bit of time in closed session this morning to start to think about some of these issues. So a lot more work to be done, but there was some mention of what might be considered sort of non-extreme events that are still high impact. So it can be longer time scale kind of things that we talked about. Whereas, to date, most of the attribution work has focused on maybe shorter time scale extreme events. And just curious from a sponsor perspective, how you might be thinking about, again, the categories of events that we aim to attribute. Kelly, you appropriately sort of put the question in our direction to think about time scale.
I toss it back to you. You guys are the experts. But I would say, given the changes that we are seeing and that we are going to continue to see, I think a broader scope here would be quite helpful.
So that the graphic from the 2016 report, all of those different phenomena operate at such different frequencies and durations. One of the things that, and this goes to the question of triggering that was asked earlier about our investment at NOAA, like how do you trigger an assessment, is that the Texas heat wave that team focused on actually was in some ways a little underlooked because it lasted for so long, and part of its cumulative damage was the fact that it was such a long-standing event, even if it didn't necessarily set an individual daily heat record during that period. So I think there are different ways of thinking about it. The really, really acute events that are very, clearly have very, very clear visible effects. But then the longer events like droughts or heat waves that extend for very long periods and have large effects on energy consumption, on infrastructure stress over time as that heat is accumulated. Of course, in a health context, a lot of heat vulnerability is due to the duration, even more than just necessarily the individual daily temperatures. So considering different frequencies, I think is very important to the report. And then I guess I'll go back to, because this is very parochial for NOAA, but the marine heat wave context, where what's going on in the Gulf of Alaska is very extreme. But it's a multi-year event that's having now systematic effects on the fisheries economy in that region, the migration of species into Canadian waters and out of US fisheries. So, that's an extreme. It has different fingerprints on it that we need to determine, particularly thinking about long-range infrastructure investments in the fishing industry in that region, for example. So certainly can benefit from the type of methods that attribution studies can provide, even if it's not a 1 day to 3 day flood. So I think being able to cast a pretty wide frequency net or spectral net over these types of events would be useful. That was not an intentional fisheries pun, by the way. I just thinking about it.
Great, thank you all very much. Deputy.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to kind of follow up on one of the questions that was asked earlier. So with the 2016 report, one of the challenges that was laid out was that, we need advances both in the fundamental understanding of extreme events, but also in methodologies that are required to do attribution. And I guess from my perspective, one of the challenges has also been that most of this research has happened in limited groups. And it's partly because there hasn't been that much funding for just the methodological development that is needed to advance some of this work. And so I was just curious to hear from each of you on what you see as the role of your agencies in supporting the development of the methodological framework that's needed to advance this work.
I mean, I can start. I guess we are already supporting an initiative that is advancing the science around a certain types of extreme events, most centrally with the science being advanced with Climate Central and World Weather Attribution, and recognize a significant need for much further research. And I think that this report can play a huge role in outlining where those gaps exist, where more capacity needs to be ramped up, especially globally, right? These scientists are concentrated in very few places, and the diversity of methods that may need to be explored. And I do hope that this is an area of increasing focus for the funding community to be able to continue to advance this work. So it's not only the application in particular locales, but it's also the underlying methodological work and advancement of the science, whether it's new types of events or what have you. So this is, for sure top of mind. And I think that this report can create a really great service in outlining where you feel those needs are the greatest.
Thank you, Anjali.
Yes, just like for research collaborations, you need the researchers to develop relationships, especially when they come from different fields, etc. The funders also, on their part, need to understand the shared connections. And so in that regard, I think we did some initiatives, collaborations in mathematical geosciences, where we were trying to develop methodologies. The applied mathematicians have their own, they're in their own space. We actually have a program in maths and physical science, which is applied math, and another one, probability and statistics. And so, but we had to make connections with them, and we did. I see James Doan here, so I'm going to mention the Earth System Modeling initiative that we had was, we pushed some things, but because we were working together. So hopefully for that to happen, there needs to be some shared interests and identification. So if your study were to provide that, we can, that might happen as well. But how has it happened in the past? A couple of, program director from climate and from the applied math and probability and statistics, they co-funded things that were at the interface of those. So because for them, for the methodological, the programs that develop those kind of techniques, they're in it for generating new techniques. But then the application there has to be a pull from the application. So there is a bit of relationship developing in that regard, and mutual respect, and sort of, doing things together. So it's tricky though. It's not just like when you do collaborative research with somebody from another discipline.
Dan.
Yeah. So I think for NOAA, with a limited budget for this activity, we would, probably over the next few years want to be a beneficiary of some of the deeper thinking coming out of research projects funded by like NSF or other organizations, and sort of surveying approaches that others are using to learn from those. The approach that our team at NOAA has taken, I think, is sort of an organic triangulation of the ways of thinking about this problem across NOAA and the type of capabilities we have. So as I've mentioned before, the unique aspect that we have seasonal operational forecasts, and thus a pretty sophisticated ability to integrate thinking about how seasonal and longer range modes of variability are influencing, probabilities towards particular environments that are conducive for extremes, like, ENSO and PDO and other and MJO phases, things like that. The smaller projects that we invested in serve to some extent as an interesting test bed for different ways of thinking about doing attribution or these type of analyses, in that they, are each following different procedures, using different data sets, applying, a different balance between observationally based analyses and model-based analyses. So there's, although technique development is not the explicit goal of those projects, there's an sort of implicit aspect of that in the way those projects are working. And then Kelly also brought up AI earlier, and I think that's, potentially valuable for many aspects of providing climate services, and then also performing routine analyses of events. It's not something that's integrated yet into the work that we're doing on the attribution side at NOAA. but it is of interest in the projection side. And I think we can learn some things from that in terms of data set evaluation, extracting, edge case scenarios and events from large data sets, things like that, that AI methods are particularly valuable analytical techniques for extracting that kind of information.
Great, thank you. We're nearing the end of our time for this discussion, so I'm going to give the last question from the committee to Dennis. So Dennis, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to use my prerogative as working for the USDA and lead the committee a little bit. We've been talking about sectors and impacts and various issues. One big one that I haven't heard mentioned is food and agricultural production. We've heard fisheries, we've heard heat, we've heard infrastructure, which are all legitimate. Is food and agriculture production something that should be included as part of the scope of this?
I don't want to step on USDA's toes, but so glad that you're here. But I think the answer is yes. It's just, there's different agency responsibilities, but certainly like through our effort in drought and water resource work in partnership with USDA, DOI through, NIDIS and other methods, thinking about impacts on water systems, food systems is very important. For NOAA in particular, thinking about marine food production is very key to our mission. But we've collaborated with USDA, for example, for the first time co-leading the agriculture chapter in NCA and thinking about food systems more holistically.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think obviously the impacts on food security are the greatest from a climate and biodiversity perspective. It's obviously also very key where if you lose food productivity, you have further encroachment into primary forests, and it leads to agricultural emissions and what have you. So I would definitely encourage coverage of food security, obviously huge consequences for migration as well. This would be top of mind for us. We have a large commitment around sustainable food systems, and I would hope that this would cover it for sure.
Yes, of course, food is basic. Yeah, it's food, clothing, shelter. Yeah, it's basic. So food security is high. We've worked a lot with NIFA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, on various joint solicitations, one on AI, drought for, using AI for targeted UAVs for targeted, using AI and UAVs for targeted water, dropping of water where there's drought, etc., for food security issues. So I think, that's with the AI institutes. I believe we have an AI institutes at NIFA on that front. And then with NIFA, there has been a lot of interaction on the Earth system modeling as well. And somebody, I think Kelly mentioned earlier about the minimum temperatures and the maximum temperatures. And so if you have freeze temperatures, prolonged freeze, then, you kind of, it leads to crop failures and things like that. So that would be hopefully, but to what extent you can attribute it, that's the question mark. Again, for those, depends on how large the region is, but that has direct implications on food and crop failures. And we know civilizations have collapsed because of food, so.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to conclude this part of the agenda really on behalf of the entire committee and my colleagues at the academies. Express our sincere appreciation to all of you, Kelly and Dan and Anjali, and also hiding out there, Anna Rita and David from NOAA, for taking 2 hours out of your very busy schedules to engage with the committee on these initial discussions. So thank you very much for your time. Very helpful to hear your perspectives. And we look forward to continuing to engage in open sessions to the extent that you or your colleagues are interested. So at this point, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We will start up precisely on the top of the hour at 3 p.m. local time here in Washington. And we have 4 speakers over the last 2-hour session of the day that we're going to hear from. The first being Ted Shepard from University of Reading. So for our colleagues who are online, thank you for being online. Thank you for your patience. We will reconvene here in exactly 15 minutes. So thank you all very much. Back, everyone. We can go through online. Thank you for remaining online. We're going to move to the next part of our agenda, where we're going to hear from 4 speakers on the topic. And it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, that is Ted Shepard, who's the Grant Professor of Climate Science in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading. Okay. Sorry, I've been talking and I forgot to turn my microphone on. Want to say we're going to begin with the next part of the agenda, where the committee has the opportunity to hear from 4 very distinguished speakers this afternoon, talking obviously on the topic of interest to the committee. And it's a pleasure to welcome our first speaker. You can see the 4 speakers up there. Our first speaker is Ted Shepard, who is the Grantham Professor of Climate Science in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading. Ted was a member of the 2016 National Academy's Committee on Extreme Weather Events and Climate Change Attribution, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about that study and move on beyond that a bit. So Ted, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, and you're going to draw the slides, right? Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a study in contrast. We've already heard about the 2003 European heat wave, which was the event that kind of set the whole subject off. And there were two papers I want to highlight on that. One is from my colleagues at the University of Reading, led by Emily Black. That was a very detailed study of the various causal factors behind the event, the persistent anticyclone, the SST anomalies, the drying of the land surface, the surface fluxes, and so on. And they concluded it is not known at this time why the large-scale circulation had the character it did. The other paper was by Peter Stott and colleagues, and they ignored all those factors explicitly, and targeting a much weaker, coarse-grained event of only 1.6 degrees C above the mean to avoid selection bias. Nobody dies from 1.6 degrees above the average. Black et al. Is certainly a highly cited paper, but Stott has clearly become the dominant paradigm. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in the report, it was motivated by the rapid growth of extreme event attribution studies, for example, in the BAM special supplements. And I think there were 2 main themes. So one was the importance of framing. There was a whole chapter on framing, and it's exemplified by the figure on the left, which is a replotting of a figure from Otto et al. On the European heat wave, the Russian heat wave. And the vertical axis is inverse probability or return time in a log scale, and the horizontal axis is magnitude, and the green is the historical period, and the blue was the current period. And so you can, just to say that you can represent an extreme either as a change in likelihood or a change in magnitude, and they're basically two sides of the same coin. The second theme I think was very important was the importance of background knowledge, and we've already seen this figure more than once, I think, so far. The figure showing the vertical axis is the confidence in the capability to attribute a specific event, and the horizontal axis is the understanding of that type of event. And the message here is you can't go above the 45-degree line. You can't attribute what you don't understand physically. And so on that basis, the different kinds of extreme events were essentially ranked in terms of the knowledge. Next slide. or next click, yeah. So I think I remember Climate Central telling us that their motivation was that they wanted to know whether probabilistic event attribution, and I'll use the acronym PEA, was a credible scientific method. And the report endorsed it, and I think it's fair to say that world weather attribution was off to the races and has been a very successful operation ever since. Less noticed, perhaps, was that the report also endorsed what it was called strongly conditioned, or these days might be called storyline attribution, although I think it's fair to say that some members of the PEA community didn't notice that endorsement and were critical of storyline approaches for some time. This approach has been developing more slowly, but it's increasingly prominent. I see more and more coverage of this using a variety of conditioning methods. I think on your side of the pond, it's mainly for tropical cyclones, but it's also been used in other areas. Next click, please. So I just want to present the probabilistic logic. The storyline approach is sometimes thought of as not involving probabilities, but it does involve probabilities. And this equation from the report, equation 2.4, was, I think, a very important equation. If you have two events, it's a basic axiom of probability theory that the joint probability of two events, A and B, is equal to the probability of A conditional on B times the probability of B. And so this is just a fundamental axiom. And if you look at the ratio of probabilities, so F is the numerator is the factual climate, the present day typically, and the counterfactual is generally in the past or pre-industrial. And you can split it into, you can split a joint probability of an event and a conditioning factor like a blocking anticyclone or El Nino or something like that. You can write it as the product of the probability of the event conditional on that conditioning factor times the ratio of the probabilities of the conditioning factor. And the whole point of this is that these conditioning factors, it could be an SST anomaly, it could be a blocking anticyclone. We often can't say very much about how the dynamical conditions might change under climate change. So the ratio on the right hand, the last term there, PF over PC, if you don't know, it could just be 1, it could be greater than 1, it could be less than 1. A Bayesian would just put some uncertainty around 1. And then the other factor, the ratio of conditional probabilities, probability of the event conditional on that factor, if it's a strongly conditioned thing, such as a local atmospheric circulation, say a blocking anticyclone for a heat wave, that basically represents what could be considered the thermodynamics, the thermodynamic effect of climate change, the effect on, let's say, precipitation or temperature given the circulation. And that provides a reasonable prior, and certainly not an overestimate, as is sometimes claimed. I don't know where that idea comes from. Pending further evidence. So you can make a thermodynamic attribution, and then you can think separately about the possible dynamical changes. As Lisa Lloyd and I have argued in a paper on the linkages to tort law, you can say it's more likely than not, which might be good enough for your purpose. Next slide. So that seed was already in the report. Now I want to make a slight aside here that, of course, probabilistic attribution requires an aggregation, and you aggregate over an event class. And this is an extreme form of aggregation from the summary for policymakers of the AR6 Working Group 1 report. People are probably familiar with this. This is talking about change in precipitation, heavy precipitation over land. That's one of the event types in which we have high confidence. And you can see that it's over the entire land surface and all kinds of heavy precipitation events. Now, you might think that doesn't make any sense. You're putting together tropical cyclones, monsoon rainfalls, severe convective systems, and so on. So but it does make sense after all. It's IPCC, and the point is that if you aggregate over enough things, you get a robust result. And you see, if you look at the magnitude, it's basically increasing about 7% per degree of warming, which is a Clausius Clapeyron scaling. So that's informative, but it's only a prior. If you really want to look at tropical cyclones, you know that you've got to look at it more specifically. And a factor that increases risk across the population, while a relevance for anybody interested in effects on entire populations, cannot be reliably applied to individuals within that population because the real world is not independent and identically distributed. So when you take an event class, which is what's done in probabilistic event attribution, you're not attributing that particular event. You are attributing classes that are like that event. And how informative it is for that particular event depends on how much events in that event class look like that particular event. And so it really comes down to the level of conditioning. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, maybe I have a slow connection here. I'm not seeing there. Oh. Next, yeah. Oh, I don't know if you're seeing what I'm seeing, but I'm seeing.
We're trying to work it out here.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Hmm.
Sorry, Ted, we're just reopening your slides. Thanks for your patience.
Okay. No worries. Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to just talk about a few of the recommendations that were in the report and whether they've been followed or not. So the first two were rather technical. For probabilistic attribution, the committee was quite negative about fraction of attributable risk. There were a number of statisticians on the committee, and they recommended that it can be misleading. So they recommended a risk ratio instead. I think that's been done. And to communicate changes in both frequency and magnitude, because frequency is the more impressive number, but magnitude is perhaps the more physically interpretable number, and that's been done. There was another statement, it wasn't a recommendation quite, but I give the quotation. Statements about attribution are sensitive to the way the questions are posed and the context within which they are posed. So I think that was recommending a statement about sensitivity to those things. And just to give an example again from IPCC, the hot extremes over land, if you look at a 10-year event versus a 50-year event, the change in magnitude for a 4-degree of warming is about the same, 5.1 or 5.3 degrees. But the change in likelihood is very different. It's about a factor of 10 for the 10-year event and a factor of 40 for the 50-year event, because you're in a different part of the probability distribution. So I think that's sensitivity hasn't been really discussed very much. Next slide. Then there was another recommendation was comparison of multiple methods. And I think it's fair to say that hasn't been done very much. But here's two examples of comparisons of the probabilistic approach and the storyline approaches, which give complementary, and I want to say quantitative information. I read sometimes the storylines are qualitative. And again, I have no idea where that idea came from because they are very quantitative. And this is for the Russian heat wave, but also there's an interesting study on the right about the 1963 German winter. This is actually the reverse of the usual thing, where the factual was in the past in 1963, and the counterfactual was present day. This was motivated by the Ukraine war and the energy crisis in Europe, and what would happen if a 1963 winter, which is an extremely cold winter, happened again. Yes, it's less likely, but the conclusion was it's still possible. Next slide. So cold extremes are interesting too. Then there was the committee, as I said, there were several statisticians. There was a lot of concern about selection bias. And so there was a statement here, attribution studies of individual events should not be used to draw general conclusions about the impact of climate change on extreme events as a whole. And although we didn't mention it, I think the committee was very nervous about this kind of summary table that existed at the time in the BAM special supplement, which seemed to be kind of a checklist, right? How many are worse? How many are less extreme? I see that there's no summary table in the special supplement anymore. And to avoid selection bias in the choice of studies, and that has not really been done. The way forward that the committee recommended was operationalization. Next click. So there's a quotation from the report: a path forward to avoiding selection bias is to perform event attribution on a predefined set of events of several different types that could reasonably be expected to occur in the current climate. Next slide. And the point of operationalization isn't to make it a turnkey operation, it's to avoid selection bias and to allow evaluation. And they say one possible approach to evaluate would be to use a large sample of objectively selected events on a global scale to evaluate if on average model predictions or simulations are on target. This could involve decadal and seasonal predictions. And Lenny Smith had testified to the committee and recommended this approach, and we refer to it as Lenny's basket, although it was never put in the report. Next click. And the World Climate Research Program does have a lighthouse activity explaining and predicting Earth system change that will be, I think, trying to do some of this. So there is a framework internationally on it. Next slide. So now I'll talk about a few developments, and I think it's fair to say that the storyline approach has become mainstream since then. In this paper that I led, but there were quite a large group of authors on it, we defined storylines to be a physically based unfolding of past climate or weather events or plausible future events or pathways. That includes event attribution, but of course it's a more general concept. It's the definition is part of the IPCC glossary. And to illustrate it, we had this event of an unforecasted rain on snow event in the Swiss Alps, where a cold front came through in the autumn, dropped a meter of snow. Then a warm front came through, melted the snow. There was an atmospheric river tucked behind it. They had a rain on snow event. There were mudslides, and a tunnel got blocked, and a valley was cut off from the outside world. So this is a very compound event. I don't know how you would define an event class for this. And it wasn't forecasted because there was a cedar feeder circulation that was below the resolution of the weather forecast model. Next slide. Oh, that's straight. Okay, it got shrunk the text at the very beginning. So imagine blowing up the first text. So the other development, I think, is concerned for what are called type 1 and type 2 errors. Type 1 is a false alarm, and type 2 is a missed warning. And I think the focus of attribution and indeed of climate science in general is to avoid false alarms, but the missed warnings are important too. And Lloyd and Oreskes have really emphasized this in a paper a number of years ago. And the figure at the bottom shows the SPM figure for attribution of drought, agricultural and ecological drought. And you can see that for 2/3 of the world, no statement can be made either because of low agreement in the type of change or in a few cases, limited data. But in fact, so that challenges, it's hard to reject the null hypothesis. But on the other hand, there's a lot of concern about missed warning, and there's actually a wealth of information in some of these regions if you express it in conditional form, like conditional on SSTs, and then you can find that in chapter 10 of the report. And just to note in passing that using a region like IPCC does can obliterate important details. Next slide. Another development is the growing mismatch between observed and modeled trends in many regions. Perhaps most famous is the east-west equatorial Pacific SST gradient shown on the left here. So this is a gradient. This is a trend over 60 years, and the observational estimates are the 4 black bars on the left, but then the models are all the way towards the right. And this has only got worse in the last 10 years, and it actually extends back even further. And on the right, Tiffany Shaw led a recent paper documenting the known model observation discrepancies in historical trends, and you see there's many of these. So it's pretty hard to use models for attribution when you got these discrepancies in long-term trends. Next slide. Another development is the increasing of record-shattering extreme events. So according to these generalized extreme value fits, sometimes the events that are observed are stated not only to be impossible in the historical climate, but even impossible in the current climate, even though we just saw them. This is an example by Eric Fisher and colleagues using the CESM, where you see a record-shattering event in the model world in the time series there, and when you do the GEV fits on the right, they don't come close to capturing that. So I think we have to rethink the GEV fit, because we're just obviously not out in the asymptotic limit. Next slide. Oh, sorry, the fonts all got shrunk. Another development is the growing use of climatic impact drivers. For example, IPCC in the Working Group 1 report has gone into this in a very heavy way. For example, fire weather rather than wildfire itself. And of course, that creates a possible disconnect between the climatic impact drivers and impacts. Now, there's two problems here. One is that by defining an event by exceedance of a threshold, the implicit assumption is that there were no impacts for a below threshold non-event. So you might say that the event was impossible without climate change, but that doesn't mean that that there wouldn't have been impacts. And so the impact attribution may be considerably exaggerated by the hazard attribution. The second point is that the impacts invariably depend on non-climatic human factors. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. That was already emphasized in the 2016 report for drought and wildfire. Here's the photo from the Libya flooding. And we have multiple causal factors. We need a forensic approach to impacts, not just a yes-no attribution of climate change, in particular because the socioeconomic situation and the managed environment are precisely the causal factors that are to be addressed through adaptation measures. So it's really important to know how important they were. Next slide. And finally, I hope I get some injury time here. The difference between what you might call a top-down approach, which is a predictive approach, because attribution is generally about prediction and the difference in predictions, and what you might call a bottom-up explanatory approach. When you have the top-down approach, you get this famous cascade of uncertainty, and especially as you go into impacts, this can really obscure the information content. But Lisa Lloyd and I have argued in a recent paper, you can work backwards. This is from within the climate, the physical climate space, where you might have, for example, a heat wave that's conditional on it blocking anticyclone, and that's conditional on an SSD anomaly, and so on. But obviously, you can take this right down to the impact scale. And different point we make in that paper is the different framings of the attribution question, in particular whether or not internal properties of the climate system are included, lead to very different possible and responsive answers. And this is fully compliant with the IPCC detection and attribution guidelines. Next slide. So I'll just summarize to say that the report endorsed both the probabilistic and the conditional or storyline approach. I think probabilistic attribution has developed quite a mature protocol, but event definition it is a sticking point because it's always not an obvious part of the process at all, very subjective. Conditional or storyline approaches have developed more slowly using a variety of conditioning methods, but their use is now growing rapidly. It's important to note that there's a spectrum of conditioning levels, and for example, the analog methods that have been around for a while serve as a bit of a bridge. And the way I see it, the inference can go either from the general to the particular, which is what you do with probabilistic attribution. You make a statement about an event class, and then you make an assumption that that event class is somehow representative of the particular event. So that involves uncertainty. Or you can go from the particular back to the general various storylines with that Bayesian, or it's not even Bayesian, conditional probability equation I wrote. But either way, and there's uncertainties that way too, but you can't avoid the uncertainties, but the quantitative result is quoted as only a prior. So really, it's a question of how one wishes to manage the uncertainties from the top down or the bottom up. And background knowledge, and that's of epistemic uncertainty, the uncertainty in your physical knowledge is key, but it's only made quantitative within a Bayesian framework. And I think one of the challenges is how to manage this in terms of communication, because statistics is hard enough, and Bayesian statistics is usually felt to be even harder. So I think the two main challenges are the operationalization, as I said, to avoid selection bias, but importantly, to allow the verification. It's not just making it a turnkey operation, it's much, much more than that. And the second is the attribution of impacts. We've already heard about that from many of the speakers, and links to disaster risk reduction, because we have multiple causal factors, and it's a disservice if we just look at the climate change factor. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Ted. And just as a reminder, we're prioritizing committee member questions because of time constraints. We had a few technical challenges, so I'm going to allow a full, not very much time, but 10 minutes or so for the committee to ask questions of Ted. So I'd like to open it up to the committee to ask questions of Ted. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Ted. I guess I want to ask a question again about this issue of the thermodynamic versus dynamic response. And maybe thinking about the big heat wave in the west coast of the US and British Columbia in 2021. I mean, the 2016 report put attribution of heat waves as something that was largely understood. It was, I think, at the top of the sort of understood list. Yet this was a heat wave that was clearly driven by a significant teleconnection pattern from the tropics. It was no doubt amplified by atmospheric rivers, which boosted humidity, and undoubtedly amplified further by CO2. But the heat wave itself and the fact that it persisted such a long time and led to extremely dry conditions, which led to fires up across the West Coast, was basically a dynamic effect of those teleconnections. The question and you've kind of highlighted the issue that I think you actually said something like it's difficult to use models for attribution when there are such mismatches in trends. And yet your storyline approach, deliberately conditions on circulation, so it can't attribute the circulation to climate change or not. For example, whether the tropical heating that forced the teleconnections had an effect. I guess my kind of question is, and I say this having listened to the sponsors, who I feel probably don't appreciate the subtlety of this question about the distinction between thermodynamics and dynamics, and they probably just link it all together. And I think a lot of the public don't understand this either, and they think when we say a heat wave's been caused by CO2, they probably think of the whole shooting match, the circulation and the temperature. The question is, I guess, how much do you think this should be an issue for this new report, to think about the two kind of parts of the problem interacting? Do you think this is an important issue, or should we just continue to be satisfied with just looking at the thermodynamics?
No, I think it should be looked at both. And I guess the methods that are so far used for the storyline type attribution, as you say, are strongly conditioned and then cannot address or do not address how likely the change in the teleconnections might be. But that doesn't have to happen from the same analysis. The equation basically makes clear that there's two parts of that, and you could draw on other forms of information, other sources of knowledge, different kinds of models even, to look at the teleconnection part. So, the thing about the kind of a causal network framing, which is what that effectively is that you can use the best source of information for each link. You don't have to use one model.
Which type of model would you look at to determine the climate change contribution to the teleconnections?
Well, I think you have to look at observations for a start, don't you? And then I guess, and that may be where, I don't know, paleoclimate things come in. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it can't be avoided. If you want to really talk about the attribution, you would have to discuss the whole thing. But the probabilistic approach has the same problem, but just buries it, doesn't it? So I think being explicit about that lack of knowledge, and maybe there would be different kinds of models that could pick out the different hypotheses. Yeah, you could have multiple hypotheses, perhaps, if you really weren't sure, and you could ask what the consequences might be under the different hypotheses. So I think you have to deal with the whole chain. And if you have evidence that there could be changes going on in dynamics, I mean, I think in many cases it may not be so important, but there's definitely, as you say, especially this big puzzle about Pacific SST gradients. I mean, that could be a huge issue. So if that's not somehow addressed, so I think large scale dynamics and low frequency variability has to be part of the attribution problem, I would say.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I want to move on. We have at least a couple more questions. Jen?
Yeah, just a simple question, perhaps. Could you just elaborate on, well, first of all, just to say, I'm not surprised people are confused by the word storyline and thinking that that is qualitative source of information. So could you just elaborate on where why that's called storyline? The orange.
Oh, well, at this, in this workshop, we had about 20 people and we were discussing what to call it. And actually the term came, a colleague, Olivia Martios, who works on the weather climate interface, some of you might know from Switzerland, and she said it was widely used in the hydrological community as basically a causal explanation. And so we sort of discussed various possibilities. We didn't want to call it a narrative, you know, and so on. So that's where it came from. But, you know, we shouldn't get hung up on the word. If you prefer strongly conditioned, that's fine. That's just a kind of a technical term.
Thank you. Tanisha.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Ted, for the presentation. Two quick things. Are there any areas, and I think you spoke to the sticking point with respect to event definition, but can you highlight any areas in the science that you think these are areas where consensus is difficult? And do you have any recommendations for us as we draft the report with these in mind? And then two, were there any unintended applications of the report that you saw over the years that you may want to suggest more clear communications around these types of issues?
I'm not sure what consensus, do you mean in the committee, or did you mean the wider community?
Broader community, attribution community. There were some issues that are difficult to find consensus around.
Well, I think over time it is sort of evolving, and there's more and more I mean, it's a pretty standard scientific principle that you have to look at things from as many different perspectives as possible. And the fact that the, you know, different levels of conditioning give you different statements, but they're not inconsistent with each other. They're just complementary because they're answering different questions. So I think that's the key. I mean, Lisa Lloyd has written a lot about this in other areas of science as well. I guess that's what philosophers of science do, that I think we're kind of sloppy in climate science with our questions, because we figure that the answers in the data and the figures, but philosophers remind us that actually the phrasing can be very important. That was the framing part. That's why we had a whole chapter in framing, actually. So I think as long as we're clear about the fact that different questions have different, the answers will sound different, but that doesn't mean that they're incompatible. That's very important. So I think the framing is still an important issue. You said any misinformation. I don't really, I can't think of any things pretty specifically, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Before we move on to the next speaker, I'm going to give the last question to Joyce. Joyce, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ted, for the very interesting talk. So, I mean, you mentioned clearly that I think for the risk-based approach, it's I mean, in the 2016 report, I think from the recommendations in the report, it looks like for the risk-based approach that the uptake has been relatively higher than the storyline. And are you sort of making a recommendation that at least this report should look at ways in which finding ways in which actually the uptake of the storyline, or rather complementarity of the storyline with the risk-based approach would be good, especially in approaching events, looking at different events, whether you want to look at the conditionality of it or stuff. But also, I think I would like you as well to comment so on the on sort of the operationalization, like doing operational attribution. We're seeing many centers now starting to do that. One thing that, and I think you agreed to that in your presentation, is on the issue of the event definition. In most cases, in most risk-based approaches, I see that they try to maximize on the extremity of the event, and also looking at sort of the impacts as well. So like constraining to the impacts. So in the storyline approach, which kind of event definition would you sort of recommend, which you think would give a more sort of robust assessment Sorry, I'm asking a very long question, but
Okay, well, I think there were two questions there, so I hope I don't forget the second one, as usually happens. So the first question on the complementarity, I think it's actually very important because to me, the probabilistic attribution is actually very close to just climate projections. I mean, they are just climate projections, basically. So if you want to bridge the basic knowledge, like in the figure from the last report that we've already seen, you have to connect the knowledge about individual events with the knowledge about general classes of events. So of course, the probabilistic approach is perfectly designed for that. And then as you have more levels of conditioning, you can deal with events that, for example, can't be done for whatever reason. For example, a lack of long data records. Maybe the climate models aren't good at representing things. For example, the Libya flooding involved apparently a metacane, which is well below the resolution of any model. And I think with impacts, it's the way to get through to very detailed impacts, because the impacts depend on the details of the event, and that's where the storyline approach can help. So I think as a way to connect that whole chain to the broader knowledge and the detailed impacts, the combination of the two is very, and in fact, a spectrum will be very helpful. And yeah, in terms of event selection, actually, it depends on the method. But for example, in the method that I have used a bit, which is the nudging method, you don't have to define the event. You just run your model with and without, different SSTs and greenhouse gases, and the user can define the event they want. You've got the full spatiotemporal evolution of, let's say, a drought, and different users can define the event in different ways, which is what they would do anyway, actually. So there's no need to make an arbitrary choice. You have the full data set. It's the forecast-based approaches it would be more complicated, but it depends on the method.
All right. Thank you very much, Ted, for your presentation, for taking time out of your schedule to talk to the committee. Just to remind the committee, we are in information gathering mode, and we can follow up with any of these speakers with some additional questions if we wish. Because of time constraints, we're going to move on now to our next speaker, who I see, Michael Weiner. Good to see you, Michael. Michael, just brief introduction, is a senior scientist in the Applied Mathematics and Computational Research Division at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So thank you for joining us today, Michael, and we look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jim. I'm also on and off the chair of the International Detection and Attribution group. Done that for quite a number of years. Our next IDAG meeting will be in early April at the Berkeley Lab, and I would invite committee members to attend and or present at our meeting. You can contact me for further details. This is the recent flood in Pakistan. Can I have the next slide, please? So it's important that, it'd be pretty obvious to say, but these are my opinions and not that of my institutions or even my co-authors, some of whom are on the committee. And I'd like to start out with just saying almost a decade ago, I had an opportunity to present to the National Academy's previous attribution report committee, and I was specifically asked to comment on rapid attribution. At the time, I thought it was not likely anytime soon. We had been tied up with a study on the Boulder floods that had taken months to figure out. What I hadn't anticipated was how much progress would be made, given the rather small event attribution community, and it is a rather small group. But this has changed. And rapid attribution statements about hurricane precipitation have been made by Kevin Reed, Mark Risser, and myself quite frequently. And the World Weather Attribution Group makes rapid attribution statements on a regular basis. And so I'd ask the committee to consider that the rate of progress may indeed be high again in the context of the science of extreme event impact attribution. So let's talk about impact attribution. Can I have the next slide, please? So I think it's pretty obvious that we understand the effects on the meteorology pretty well now and on individual events. And what I'm advocating is something I call end-to-end attribution, which takes that information and informs about the impact rather directly. And so here's how it can work. You can make an attribution statement about the change in the weather. you know, say 20% more rain because of climate change, or it's 2 degrees centigrade more warmer in a heat wave. And then use this information to inform the anthropogenic change in the impact. You know, so using like a flood model for the rain, or a mortality model for the heat, and this has been done in a number of papers. Or you can even use a chain of impact models, and I'll go through an example of Hurricane Harvey, some work that we did. Sarah's paper, I know you guys have discussed, this puts a lot of this in perspective. Next slide, please. So Hurricane Harvey, here it is right off the coast of Texas. Next slide, please. What made this storm so unusual is it stalled and rained for days. The numbers are the dates in August and then in early September. And you can see that, you know, around the 25th, it just stuck there. So here's how the end-to-end attribution would work. Next slide, please. So Harvey, there was a degree of warming attributable to the humans in the Gulf. Harvey produced copious amounts of precipitation. 3 groups looked at this relatively rapidly. Myself and Mark Risser, Gert-Jan van Oldenburg, and then Simon Wang, who I didn't even know at the time. And we all concluded that the effect of climate change on Hurricane Harvey's precipitation was large, and in fact, considerably greater than that expected by Clausius Clapeyron, which was actually as an aside, was quite mystifying at the time. I think we understand that now, and that's an example of how event attribution can actually increase our understanding of how climate change affects these events. But anyway, that's the attribution statement. So a best estimate would be that, you know, using these 3 studies, that a 19 or 20% change in the precipitation due to climate change during Hurricane Harvey. Next slide, please. So how can we take this to impacts? Well, we could go from the rain to the flood. And as Ted was telling us about storylines, this would be a kind of a storyline. And we could simulate I had the opportunity at a conference in Jamaica to meet Chris Sampson, and he had a model of Hurricane Harvey in floods using the Fathom 30-meter hydraulic model. And they had driven it with this precipitation estimate that you see there, which is similar to what Mark and I had used. And so that was the flood that was. And I asked him, I said, can we make the flood that might have been? And let's just take this observed a precipitation pattern and change it by the attribution statement. And so for our 24% statement, we would multiply this by 0.81. So there's less rain. Next slide, please. And so we can compare maps from this flood model of the flood that was and the flood that might have been had there been a 20% change in precipitation. And we find that there are regions that, you know, were flooded with climate change and were not flooded without. And so you could ask the question, did climate change flood my house? And this particular area is South Houston, which had 8,000 flooded homes. And, you know, you could say, if you lived in one of these areas, you could say, well, yeah, it was or it wasn't. Or you could, if it were flooded, you could see that, you know, it's deeper flood because of the increased rain. Now, NOAA estimated that the total loss is $155 billion in this event. The reinsurance companies say the insured loss is about $90 billion. And so we can make sort of a impact attribution statement at least relevant to the insurance agents that the risk of an insured loss of $90 billion was quadrupled. But that 14% increase in the rain in the area of flooded area does not necessarily reflect directly the increase in the damages. And the next slide, which you just previewed, will tell you why. This is from a study with Kevin Smiley, who's on the committee, that used that kind of the flood maps, and he combined it with real estate and census data to show that, you know, the damages are not uniformly distributed across their area. And in fact, you know, people don't live uniformly throughout any area. And so there are places that were more impacted in the greater Houston area than others. The next slide, please. So the bottom line of that paper that I like to highlight is that, you know, for that 20% increase in precipitation, 32% more homes were flooded. And so, that's actually a lot. And, if you make an assumption that the homes were more or less the same value, you could say that a third of that $155 billion loss was due to climate change. Kevin also found that there were environmental injustices, and that these damages were not distributed equally across different socioeconomic groups, and particularly the low-income Hispanic communities were disproportionately affected. And that's kind of, I think, an important statement to make. Next slide, please. So to summarize that, here's the end-to-end. A degree of warming in the Gulf caused 20% more rain, which caused 14% more flooding, which caused 32% more homes to be flooded, which cost us $50 billion. Just to show you where we're going currently with this kind of thing, the next slide, please, is a work in progress using a rapid attribution statement that Kevin and I made about Hurricane Ian, which was the third most costly event, tropical cyclone event in the United States and the costliest in Florida. We found a 20% increase in precipitation. You can see the factual and counterfactual storyline simulations there in the lower left. That caused lots of inland flooding a few days after landfall as the water ran through the system. But there also was a 15-foot storm surge of saltwater flooding in Fort Myers Beach. And the question is, how does climate change affect that? And that, of course, is dependent on the winds. And so with Myth and Debit, PNNL, we're currently trying to construct a defensible storyline using the wind estimates from Kevin's calculations to drive FVCOM, which is a storm surge model. And this was supposed to be an animation for the winds, but it didn't animate, which is fine. Next slide, please. So here's a question. I know Joyce is online, and she'll have comments, I hope. And the question is, can event attribution inform loss and damage negotiations? And as you probably know, the UNFCCC Conference of Parties has set up a fund for this purpose. And I think the first question that I would ask is, what kind of events are important in developing nations? And from the WMO, they looked at the deadly events between 1970 to 2019, so a long period of time. And the top 10 ones are agricultural droughts, or in the top 10 are agricultural droughts, tropical storms, non-tropical storms, and heat waves. And I would argue that all these kinds of events are things that event attribution does pretty well for characterizing the change in the meteorology. The third one is probably the most difficult, or the least studied, perhaps. And whether or not how accurate these death totals are is also a question. And many people I've talked to think that far more people in developing nations have perished because of heat waves. It's just that it's a difficult data collection exercise. But these are things that we do pretty well. And so let's move on to the next slide, please. But the question is not without some controversy. Andrew King wrote a paper saying that it's not ready to play a major role. And he argued that event attributions in developing nations is incomplete. This is certainly true. And it's true for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is authors tend to write about things close to their homes, but also because data is difficult. We reply to that and say that nonetheless, we think that because these four classes of events are things we do relatively well, that these kinds of studies can be done. They just haven't been done in the numbers that need to be. And then Joyce has a paper that is a rather broad view. And I think the title, Navigating the Complex Relationship Between Attribution Science and Loss and Damages, I think is really important. Can we go back, please? And she points out that attribution should not be a requirement to claim loss and damages. And I strongly agree with that. I think that, what we can do is what the role, I take this from the IPCC, the role of the IPCC reports are, is to inform decision makers. And as scientists, that's what we do. We inform decision makers. We don't make the decisions. That's an inherently political decision for how these funds would be distributed. But I would argue that some information is better than no information. Next slide, please. So it's obviously a challenge. The limitation of weather observations is a challenge, but maybe even a bigger challenge would be limitations of socioeconomic data. But here's a partial solution based on storylines. We can do the weather by doing a storyline initialized with ERA reanalysis. That's typically what we've done a lot of that with the hurricanes and some with heat waves. And construct a counterfactual cooler climate with either a CMIP6 ensemble or one of the large ensembles or other ways. Figure out, say, what that is. And then in the context of a flood, we can run a flood model like Kevin did or some other more sophisticated hydrological model. And that can be validated with satellites. When I talked to hydrologists, they said, well, we would use that in the developed nations too. So it's not really a stretch. And as Ted said, storylines inform directly about the magnitude change, which I think is really relevant for figuring out loss and damages and impacts in general. And he does present a way to change to estimate changes in probability with uncertainty quantification required, but it's not generally directly provided by the storylines. But the magnitude change is conditional on all the things that the way you make up the storyline. Next slide, please. So I think to summarize, this connection from climate change to impacts is challenging, but it's particularly challenging for developing nations, which I think are probably which is where, in my view, is the most important thing we need to do. And rigorous and attribution for events of these nations may not be as complete as we would like to have, or as we might be able to do in the developed economies. For instance, for heat, the mortality available data might be unavailable, but agricultural data might be. When dollars or cents or pounds or euros are involved, counting tends to be a little bit more accurate. And for floods, population density may be available from either remote sensing or from other sources. And the going from the weather impacts an attribution statement on the weather to an attribution statement on the impacts is a highly multidisciplinary effort. Requires people with talents that no one person generally is going to have. And so a multidisciplinary team is really critical, no matter where you're doing this. But I think for developing nations, it's really important that both physical and social scientists from these nations be actively involved, not just to establish credibility, but because their perspective is critically important. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that talk. Really appreciate it. Okay, open it up for questions to Michael from the committee. Okay, I see a number of hands. Tim, go ahead.
Hi, Michael. Just come back to Hurricane Harvey for a minute. You mentioned that what made it so devastating was the fact that the hurricane stalled over Houston, and therefore just dumped loads of rain for several days. And then you said that the attribution you got of 24% was more than you'd expected from Clausius-Clapeyron. So can I infer from that that you are your attribution method attributed part of that stalling to climate change?
No.
If so,
No.
how did you work that out?
No, it did not. These statements well, maybe Garrett Jans has a little bit of it, but Simon's was a real storyline. Ours was a statistical inference. All of these, basically overlap. There were independent data, independent scientists, independent methods, very different methods, in fact, and they all came up with a similar answer. And at least in Simon and our analysis, the stalling wouldn't have been wasn't considered. So the world that was had the stall in Simon's analysis, and the world that might have been had it as well. And this superclasses clapeyron.
Sorry, so it could have been that climate change actually had a bigger impact than you were.
Well, the problem is that we're never going to be able to say anything about stalls. The stall like Harvey's is so rare. There are only a few storms that it's ever happened to. So it's not something we're going to get out of the observational record, I think. But the superclasses clapeyron thing really confused me for a long time. And Chris Patricola and I had a paper in Nature where we looked at 15 different storms, and we found this again and again and again. And Kevin and I have had a couple papers with the same thing. And what I think I understand it now. And it's not something magical. It's just basically that the winds are a little stronger. And that's causing actually substantial changes in vertical motion, which is causing precipitation efficiency to increase. And I think some of the outstanding things we need to do is still be able to make attribution statements about changes in wind speed. There's been a few recently on Hurricane Helene. And we made a statement on Hurricane Helene, and that revealed that the pattern of the influence of climate change is actually quite complex in a region with high topography. So that, yeah, I think we understand that it's not, this is not that complex. It's just there's more energy, there's more moisture available by Clausius clapeyron, there's more energy available by heating, and so the storm is more efficient at precipitating, regardless of changes in say slowing down or installing, frequency. So yes, climate change could be even a bigger factor than most published attribution statements.
Thanks,
Michael. Yeah, I see 6 hands up. So let's try to keep the questions relatively brief because we'd love to get to them all. So Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I'm going to have I think a brief question, which is just, you kind of gave a couple examples of the different types of events and different types of methods that you've used for these type of attribution studies. I'm curious, which is oftentimes the things that get published. I'm curious if you could give any examples of methods or specific types of extremes that you have looked at or tried to look at with an attribution statement that have been challenging for any number of reasons.
Well, they're all challenging when we first started. Fortunately, we get a little smarter with time. I think the one that you and I have thought about a lot actually is changes in hurricane wind speed. And it turns out that, the way we categorize hurricanes by the Saffir-Simpson scale is a lousy attribution detection and attribution variable because it's pointwise and instantaneous. And I think one thing that would be interesting to do is try to develop some kind of overall, indication of tropical cyclone energy, for instance, and try to do actually trend attribution on that first, and then event attribution. So that would be a good example. We also talked about the heat wave in 2021, and it was pointed out that by Ted that it broke the statistical models. It was impossible without climate change, but it was impossible with climate change. And that's been something that we've made a lot of progress on our team with Li-Kung Zhang and Mark Risser of trying to make a statistical model using advanced spatial statistics that can explain these events. And in fact, when we do that, we come up with a risk ratio of 10, not infinity or undefined for that particular event. And so I think the multidisciplinary aspect of impact attribution and attribution in general cannot be overstated. We need climate scientists, we need statisticians, we need, who can talk our language, and we need, the social scientists that can take these kind, an epidemiologist, for instance, for heat waves, and those kinds of scientists who can take the meteorological information and translate it into impacts.
Thank you, Michael. Hillary.
Hi, Michael. I had a question about if you have any concerns about where impact attribution science could go or is headed, and how that information might be used or misused in policy discussions or other places?
Well, I don't really know if I can comment on that. I mean, I think my biggest concern is that we're not moving fast enough. In that, you see an attribution statement that this heat wave was 2 degrees centigrade warmer, but that means a lot more people died. And I don't think, those statements, how many people died in the heat wave in your neck of the woods? I'd love to go get into that question. I don't really know how, because I don't know how to get the data, the mortality data. And so I'm more concerned about the lack of information than the misuse of it. But, information gets misused all the time in ways that, are difficult to anticipate.
Yep.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for your talk. I had a more philosophical question, open-ended maybe. I think one criticism operational attribution is the lack of peer review before communicating the results. I saw that a lot of your studies that you shared today and that you usually do are peer reviewed before you make the results public or you communicate the results. So I guess, like, how do you view peer review in this kind of field, and is it always necessary? And how do you think the committee should approach the two different types of kind of reports or studies we see in extreme event attribution?
That's a great question. Kevin and I wrote an opinion piece about operational attribution, and I think I'm a very strong advocate for it, and for a number of reasons, not the least of which is to get out of the selection bias. The academic community can only do so many events. As far as the peer review goes, I would never make an attribution statement that didn't have a peer-reviewed method behind it. But obviously, if you're going to do it right away, which we've done, there's no time for that. And I would liken that the situation is similar to weather forecasting. Weather forecasters don't have peer review before they make their forecast for tomorrow's weather, but everything that is based on is very well reviewed and thoroughly reviewed. And so I would argue that operationalizing event attribution has a lot of benefits. One of which would be it could involve those experts who know a lot more about hurricanes, for instance, or even heat waves than I ever can know. And so bringing those specialists into the community would be extremely valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. Grace. Turn on your microphone, please.
Michael, thank you so much for your nice talk. You did mention the attribution about the temperature and the precipitation. So my question is about wind speed. You did touch upon some perspective of this. For wind speed, in terms of the projection from global climate modeling, so how much confidence do we have at this stage? So I'm talking about the synoptic winds. And then did people do a lot of research on the attribution? For example, in the future, synoptic winds will increase by 10%, and maybe certain percentages from climate change. Others is from other factors. Thank you.
My confidence in the CMIP class models for winds and for many other things is actually extremely low. I think it's been well documented that they just don't represent observed winds, much less their trends, particularly well. And I think this is a chance, and I think Tim might have strong feelings about this as well, where we really need a kilometer scale modeling. And there's lots of arguments for it, based on convective physics, for instance. But in particular for wind, topography is so important. And we need to have that kind of resolution. And so, for the hurricane attribution studies, the ones I like the most are the most expensive. They're the ones where we can run WRF or some other convective permitting model at 3 kilometers or better. And those actually do agree pretty well with observed hurricane winds. As far as synoptic winds, I mean, I don't think there's been a lot on that. I may be wrong on that as far as attribution studies go. There may be something coming out of the wind power community, however, that I'm unaware of.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. I know that there's additional questions, but because of time constraints, we're going to have to move on. Thank you very much.
You can always write them to me.
For your presentation. Yes, we can be in touch. Lisa, I see Lisa's online. Hi, Lisa. Thank you for joining us early in the morning for you in Australia. Lisa Alexander is our next speaker. She's a professor at the Climate Change Research Center at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. So thank you. Hope you've had your coffee and looking forward to your talk.
Yes, I have. Thanks, Jim. And hi, everyone. It's really great to be here presenting to the Academy on a recent paper that's just been published on Frontiers in Attributing Climate Extremes and Associated Impacts. And I'd like to thank Jim for inviting me. Next slide, please. The paper I'm going to talk about was led by Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick from the Australian National University, and it was commissioned by the World Climate Research Programme. And you can see that the paper was only published a few weeks ago and involved actually several people who are online right now. Next slide, please. And just to give you a little bit of further context, there were about 20 of these papers were commissioned as part of WC Open Science Conference that was in Rwanda last year. 4 so far have been published, including the one I'm talking about. And they have covered key edge topics that were addressed in the conference. Next slide, please. So as we've been hearing today, extreme event attribution is kind of a really quite young and rapidly moving field. And the concept paper that we wrote focused on sort of 6 focus areas. I won't read them out, but we'll go through them as I go through the talk. Slide, please. So I'm just showing a schematic overview of the challenges and opportunities in EA that were addressed in the concept article. The inner circle here represents the 6 topics that I showed on the previous slide, while this outer circle contains the main recommendations that we have from the paper, and I'll go through those at the end. But the circular arrows in the middle here around the red circle, then just to note that each of these topics are ultimately interrelated and dependent on one another, so independent of each other. So next slide, please. So several people have already mentioned this already, but a key underpinning of extreme event attribution is the need for long and reliable observations. And this enables us to have more robust contextualization of an extreme event in the historical record. So at the moment, weather station records really remain our most trustworthy source of observational data, particularly if they're quality controlled and homogenized. But as I've written here, substantial quantities of data measured at national levels do not report internationally. So particularly for attribution studies of recent events, data are often then drawn from real-time synoptic data that's distributed through WMO's Global Telecommunications System, GTS. And these encompass only a subset of potentially available stations. They generally have limited quality as well, and sometimes they have inconsistent definitions. So really, the figure here illustrates the dependence of recent data on these GTS reports, and in particular, the near lack of non-GTS precipitation data for many parts of the world, which you can see in the bottom right-hand plot, where when we look at years plus data ending in 2020, we're only including North America, Western Europe, and Australia. So there are other forms of observations obviously be able to help us, or observation products like satellites or analysis. Next slide, please. But actually there are issues with this as well. And I'm actually showing you an example. This is actually from Joyce's paper from last year. It's an example of extreme rainfall event that was around Rwanda from May 2023. And the plots here show the 5-day accumulations for a range of satellite, in situ, reanalysis, and blended data sets. And you can see that none of them agree on the intensity or the scale of the event. So with no available in situ observations to compare with, robust attribution statements obviously are very difficult to make. So ultimately, extreme event attribution will best be supported by regular observations with dense spatial coverage over all parts of the world, available in near real time and supported by high quality historical data. Next slide, please. So in the paper, we outline 3 broad approaches to defining events. That is a definition that will more clearly constrain any anthropogenic signal by averaging out the variability over space and time, and think large-scale precipitation versus very small-scale convective storms. As closely as possible, focus on the observed event of interest by looking at the spatiotemporal window over which it's been particularly extreme, and then to focus on the aspect of the extreme event that has contributed most towards impacts on society or ecosystems. Next slide, please. But again, there are issues and considerations with defining events, and people have already mentioned this already today. Some of the extreme event attribution depends strongly on the event definition and framing. And this is really a crucial step, but it's often the most time-sensitive step. You have to consider the spatial extent. You can apply storylines or probabilistic framing, and Ted's already talked about that. The definition, it needs to be fit for purpose, the event. And again, as has been mentioned, local knowledge is really key here for these definitions. Next slide, please. So in the paper, we also focus on the statistical challenges, and again, a lot of those have been discussed already. Here, we looked at the challenges with univariate probabilistic methods, attribution of record-shattering events, and emerging statistical methods. The GV distribution, which has already been mentioned, is commonly used approach for modeling annual maxima, whereas a generalized Pareto distribution is usually used for above threshold events. So while these events are very widely used and they appear relatively simple, and they are, there's actually active research, for example, around including shifting covariates beyond the location and additional covariance to account for physical processes like large-scale modes of variability. So this could then allow for conditional attribution statements, for example, changes in return periods given a certain climate state. Next slide, please. Okay, so this will take a little bit of explanation. Here we're looking at the plots illustrating probabilistic attribution of univariate and bivariate events. So the left-hand figure here is shows a trend plot with a non-stationary GV distribution fitted to the annual maxima temperatures in Portland. And this is obviously the Pacific Northwest event 2021 we're looking at here. So all of the black dots here indicate observed annual maxima against the global mean surface temperature, with the record-shattering event shown by the pink dot. So here the black solid line indicates the center of the distribution, which shifts with increasing global mean surface temperature, and the lines above represent the expected 6-year and I think 40-year return levels. So Ted talked about how we need to think beyond these traditional GEV approaches, and Mike also talked about some of the improvements that are being looked at to, for example, consider spatial statistics. So one issue, and Mike also alluded to this as well, is that the change in frequency is typically expressed by the probability ratio in the middle panel here. So the ratio of P1 over P0. So for very extreme events, and particularly for heat extremes, where the climate change signal is very strong, this ratio may approach infinity. And as Mike highlighted, there are people who are looking at trying to address this. Many people have also mentioned compounding and cascading events. And here on the right-hand side figure, we're showing when the impacts are caused by a combination of extreme conditions in two hazards in this case. For example, that could be something like concurrent hot and dry conditions that maybe cause crop failures, for example. So here P0 and P1 can be defined as the probability of concurrent extremes, and this is the red shading in the right-hand figure. So compound events and compound event attribution is very active and growing area of research. Next slide, please. And this is something that Ted also alluded to, and this is that many of the statistical approaches discussed so far are unconditional, in that they assume that the events of interest, all annual maxima, for example, are drawn from a single population. But of course, when a record-shattering event happens, like the Northwest Pacific event, this may no longer and is likely no longer a valid assumption. So in the most extreme cases, an event may be far outside the distribution in the previously observed record. So in such cases, we really need to rely on numerical modeling approaches. And methods have been developed to simulate trajectories of very rare extremes. And the purpose here is really to just increase the sample size rather than address any dynamical uncertainties. This is achieved by initializing a large number of model simulations with very similar dynamical conditions to those observed at or just prior to the event of interest. This can then increase the accuracy of any extreme value statistics to assess whether changes in the frequency and or intensity of the event are due to climate change. So in this figure, this is adapted from Eric Fisher's work. We see that, with a mix of large ensembles and reinitialized conditions, how this kind of ensemble boosting resulted in a simulation of a number of heat waves that were more extreme than the Pacific Northwest event. So this is something that's being looked into. Next slide, please. And again, as we've discussed, climate models are obviously very important, play a very important role in extreme event attribution. We employ them to simulate the class of extreme events in the world that was versus the world that might have been, the factual and counterfactual worlds. We derive changes in occurrence probabilities. We often called probabilistic or risk-based approaches, and we need climate models for that, whether they be global or regional scale. And again, this conditional approach, which is complementary to that, is based on event storylines, which Ted has already talked to, but for that we could utilize a large range of models from global to convection permitting. So in addition, I think the storyline approaches can include compounding factors and multivariate aspects, preconditioning, cascading impacts. And in that way, they might provide insight into the specific role of the different contributing factors. Next slide, please. So as everyone has already said, of course, our climate models need to be realistic, including being able to simulate present-day characteristics and trends in dynamical processes and feedbacks. So our current GCMs are also very coarse resolution, and as the figure shows, and this is from one of Mike's papers, the example of Hurricane Katrina, when you look at a convection permitting simulation versus a very coarse resolving model. So ultimately, our models need to get things right for the right reasons. So in this concept paper, we called for a systematic assessment of model selection guidelines. Model uncertainties, as we know, remain a challenge in extreme event attribution, but combining these with multiple lines of evidence from observations, Bayesian approaches, we can better manage these uncertainties with ensembles or many simulations. Again, I think conditional attribution methods could help here, especially to provide dynamically consistent extreme events. And the concept paper actually recommends that these methods should be further explored and developed by the wider community. And these would be beneficial for those interested in impact attribution, for example, as Mike has already outlined. Next slide, please. So on that, despite most of the focus to date being on assessing the anthropogenic signal on weather extremes, event attribution was initially developed to assess the influence of anthropogenic climate change on impacts, or on the impacts that result from them, as outlined in the sort of seminal Allen paper in 2003. And Mike's already discussed impact attribution very nicely, so I won't say much, except that impact attribution studies demonstrate more precisely the consequences of climate change for individuals and communities. And they can serve as a really powerful tool for communication, or potentially as evidence for a factual basis in lawsuits, or to contribute to climate justice discussions like loss and damage, or we might even think about remote impacts through supply chains. And I have a student working on that at the moment. So as the figure shows, impact attribution is complex, and Mike's already highlighted that. It requires teams with interdisciplinary expertise. Again, I will highlight Mike's point about this. Leaving out any one of these processes could really render the impact attribution less robust. So it really highlights how imperative it is that impact attribution is truly interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. Next slide, please. So there are even more challenges, of course, again, as Mike's outlined in impact attribution than there are in extreme event attribution. I won't go through these because Mike's already outlined a lot of them, but just to say that most extreme impacts may not be related to most or some of extreme weather. So a bottom-up approach may be needed to shift this focus. Next slide, please. So impact attribution is being increasingly demanded. There's growing policy interest in developing workable loss and damage mechanism, discussions on how we can leverage and extend insights from existing studies to help policymakers. Now, compensation through loss and damage, for example, is primarily a legal or a policy decision, but impact attribution might really be useful, especially through storylines. So impact attribution that directly assesses who experiences the additional impacts from attributable to climate change more precisely, identify the unequal distribution of the socioeconomic or health impacts of climate change. That is, the people who are most vulnerable tend to be most impacted. Next slide, please. A global increase in extreme event attribution studies has been accompanied by an increase in communication, and that's through groups like the World Weather Attribution. So communications have become more tailored, but there's actually few academic studies on public opinion on extreme event attribution. There are also problems around communicating uncertainty and presenting changes in probabilities versus changes in intensities, and I show two statements that were produced from the Pacific Northwest event, and both statements were released. But if you, just pluck one of those statements in isolation, it could appear that that event would not have happened at all in a counterfactual world, rather than it increased in intensity by 2 degrees. So I think to advance these topics, again, more interdisciplinary work, especially with social scientists, particularly cognitive communication scientists, will be needed. And a key challenge for the community will be to provide a clearer view on why we want to communicate attribution studies, to whom and with what message. So high attribution assessments are absorbed by a wide range of audiences needed. And I know I'm going out of time, but I just want to say that a challenge for the wider attribution community over the coming years is to increase this research base such that evidence-based recommendations to improve attribution communication become clearer and can be implemented. Next slide, please. And finally, we get to a revision of the figure from the 2016 report. So as a group, we took a bit of work to do this, and some arguments over where things should be placed. However, it's clear, and I think, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but someone said we want to shift these blobs to the top right-hand corner. And I think we've done that for some of those. We've made considerable gains in understanding the attribution of temperature-related extremes, whilst knowledge of other events has also improved. We've added new event categories as well, and that's the separation of drought types and tropical cyclone characteristics. And in both instances, the scientific understanding behind the attribution of one subclass is higher than the other. So I think that's something that the committee might want to consider. So it would be useful to see an updated version of this figure, because the event attribution continues to progress rapidly. Next slide, please. So I'm very nearly finished. Just in summary to say, extreme event attribution has rapidly developed over the last 2 decades, from these formative papers from Allen and Stott through to the 2016 Academy report, and now to the Perkins-Kirkpatrick review paper. Impact attribution has emerged much more recently, and extreme event attribution results regularly and are widely communicated. That also means that new challenges have emerged. Next slide, please. And just to go to show the recommendations from the paper, we recommend increased extreme event assessments and capacity building, contemporary guidelines for assessing models, establishing best practice methodologies in compound and record-shattering events, coordinated interdisciplinary engagement, and increased and ongoing investment in communication. And next is my last slide, and that's just some final thoughts. To address these recommendations, and this was in the paper, it requires significant developments in multiple fields that either underpin, such as observations and monitoring or climate modeling, or are closely related to extreme event attribution. And that would be things like compound and record-shattering events or climate impact. So, as well as working consistently with experts outside of attribution and climate science more generally, and that's a point that has been made several times. However, if approached with investment, dedication, and coordination, tackling these challenges over the next decade will ensure robust extreme event analysis with tangible benefits for the broader global community. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for summarizing that paper that involved multiple authors, of course, and I think many aspects of that are quite well aligned with our statement of tasks, so very relevant for the committee. So as before, would like to open it up to the committee for questions. Deputy.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for the presentation. So I was wondering, these extreme event attribution studies are obviously limited by the number of people that are able to be involved in these sort of studies, and also have the resources to do the kind of computational work that is required for them. But I was wondering if there's some like common building blocks that you can see that the scientific community can work on to provide some sort of systematic framework that can be used to apply at least the most well-established methods. Yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts on that. And what I'm thinking about in common building blocks, one example of what I was thinking of is like, could we just have some sort of systematic characterization of model evaluation for different types of events? So just that's where I'm going with that question. Thank you.
Yes, and as I said, actually, in the paper, we do highlight that as a thing that we think that the community should aim towards moving forward, and things like having these guidelines around model evaluation, for example, what types of models. There's also the framework of that already exists around things like the world weather attribution. So I think what we need is probably a coming together of all of these different components, because there still are different people working on lots of different parts. And that's why I've highlighted and Mike has also highlighted this transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach, because I don't think we can come up with a framework unless we involve multiple people from outside of our own community.
Thank you. Tim.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you. I wanted to kind of join the two sides of your talk together. You talked about the methodologies and the science at the beginning, and then the impacts later on. And I noted a few bullet points from your first part of your talk. You said techniques must be fit for purpose. You said about the climate models needing to be realistic. You talked about the importance of resolution for these models. You showed this I don't know what I would call it, a bit of a fudge, I guess, called ensemble boosting to try to force the models to fit the observations. It kind of worries me a bit that when we go to impacts, given these sort of issues, that we might well be underestimating impacts, and we might actually be doing a disservice to our community. An example is, Michael's talk. It's conceivable that the stalling of Hurricane Harvey was itself climate change induced, but we need obviously good models to be able to assess that. And I worry that the sort of storyline approach, where we're just looking at the thermodynamics, is potentially underestimating the impact. So my question really is, and I say this to you as a sort of representative of WCRP, I mean, are we really ready to do impacts? Should we not be spending the next 5 years getting our models, giving them the resolution that they need, making sure that we don't need to ensemble boost to kind of capture the observations in the ensembles? Maybe this should be the focus for the next few years before we really do the impact work.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with you, Tim, on much of that. I think the only thing I would say is that why can't we do both, right? So why can't we focus on the improvements in the models and the observations, along with developing the frameworks, etc., that we need to do the impact assessment? So I don't think it's an either or. I would suggest that, we could, we might not get, we might struggle a bit with the impact assessments, but we can set the framework in place to be able to do that. So I would say that maybe we can focus on both of those things.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. James.
Yeah, hi Lisa. Thanks for your summary. I was interested in your guidelines for model evaluation. So yes, I agree. There's been lots of discussion about the need for models to capture the event we're interested in, with resolution. You showed the hurricane example. Would you agree there has been less emphasis on evaluating the ability of models to capture the processes through which the events respond to climate change? That seems to be a key criterion to be fit for purpose, but I haven't seen much of that. Is that also your assessment?
Short answer is probably yes. I think you're right that we've focused a lot more on doing the attribution and presenting the results and giving the attribution statements. And I think there is a component, and this is why we say it in the paper, is that we do need this component of model evaluation. It's actually a critical part of the whole process. This has to underpin, our observations have to underpin this, and our models have to underpin this. So I don't disagree. I think a lot more work needs to be done on that, and that's certainly why we recommend that in the paper.
Thank you very much. And Grace, I know you have a question, but maybe you can enter that into the chat for Lisa to see so we can move on. Thank you so much, Lisa. Really appreciate the presentation and the time. So we're going to move on now to our fourth and final speaker for this open session, and that is Michael Berger. Michael is the Executive Director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and Senior Research Scholar at Columbia Law School. So thank you so much, Michael, for joining this open session. We look forward to your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to listen in to these extraordinarily informative and interesting presentations. And recognizing that we're towards the end of the day, I will endeavor to be brief. Am I to share my screen? Is that the way this is going to work? Okay. All right. So I've been asked to speak about the use of attribution science in legal contexts. Much of what I'll talk about is relevant to extreme event attribution, though not all of it is phrased directly in relationship to extreme event attribution. I also recognize that what I'm going to do is really provide a brief introduction and a survey, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion so that I can be of most use to you in your work. So what are the legal applications for event attribution? We can look at this in the litigation context, in the regulatory and administrative context, and then in the international context. And there's already been reference to the UNFCCC loss and damage negotiations, but there are a number of different types of claims in which we have already seen event attribution play a role. This includes constitutional and human rights claims involving government obligations to reduce emissions and prevent harms, corporate liability claims seeking compensation for climate change related damages, lawsuits challenging actions taken without adequate consideration of climate change and associated hazards, so adaptation related claims, and then also in defense when governments seek to defend their mitigation and adaptation measures. On the regulatory side, we see that event attribution science is really deeply baked into much of the agency science that under the Biden administration at least played a significant role in informing government rules, regulations, and policies. This is true of physical infrastructure and land use planning, of natural resource management and biodiversity and species protections, and of emergency preparedness and disaster response. Moving forward. Okay, there we go. So how does attribution science typically factor into climate litigation? Two key components: causation and responsibility, and foreseeability of climate impacts. In the cases in which plaintiffs are seeking to impose responsibility for emissions and achieve climate-related damages, attribution science is used to establish a causal nexus between the emissions that are attributable to a defendant's conduct, however that's conceived at whatever relevant jurisdictional or geographic scale, and the climate change related injuries that are experienced by the plaintiff, which can be a state, a city, a tribe, or individuals, among others. It also plays a role in the foreseeability of climate impacts in cases involving obligations or authorities to adapt and respond to the effects of climate change. Attribution science is used to establish the specific ways in which climate change is affecting a particular place, whether that place, again, is a jurisdiction, an individual facility, a resource or resource domain, species, and so on. So to go a little bit deeper into what we've seen so far in the context of constitutional and human rights claims, the core idea that climate change is already causing pervasive harm is well recognized. You see on the sort of viewer's right-hand side of the slide, the human rights and fundamental rights that these harms are attached to: the right to life, health, food, water, and sanitation, the right to a healthy and clean environment, and so forth and so on. Science is used to support these legal determinations of actual and imminent harm to human rights. And this has been recognized by numerous bodies, from the United Nations, a number of different bodies, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, as well as domestic courts in a number of places, including in Europe, in South America, in Pakistan, India, and elsewhere. Here in the US, perhaps most famously, and certainly with the most paperwork involved, attribution science and event attribution science played a significant role in the expert reports that were submitted as part of the Juliana litigation. And this, of course, is the youth claim brought by 21 plaintiffs against the United States government, first under the Obama administration, and then that litigation has continued forward and is actually still underway. But at a certain point, there was the submission of 18 different expert reports by people covering a range of different types of impacts, including, for, I guess, our immediate purposes here, Kevin Trenberth's report on extreme event attribution, which discussed the connection between climate change and extreme events, such as hurricanes, floods, droughts, and wildfires, and connected those events to specific injuries experienced by individuals, by the individual youth plaintiffs, including property damage, displacement due to storms and flooding, asthma and health effects, and displacement due to drought and to water scarcity. We also saw some of this type of evidence or expert testimony set forth in the Held versus Montana case, which you undoubtedly heard about, the trial court's decision from this past summer that upheld a constitutional claim against the state of Montana, which had passed a statute that required the state to ignore the climate impacts of fossil fuel projects inside the state, which basically said no Scope 3 emissions analysis was permitted under the state's environmental impact assessment law. And the court found that the ostrich with its head in the sand approach violated the plaintiff's constitutional right to a healthy environment under the Montana state constitution. And that the decision to even ignore thinking about it could exacerbate the types of, the extent of climate change and the types of impacts experienced by the youth plaintiffs themselves. The event attribution science is also used to inform state obligations with regards to climate action and greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. A number of non-US courts have recognized that these obligations are rooted in human rights, whether phrased as a 2-degree or well below or 1.5-degree target. And we've also seen courts in the US acknowledge that climate change is the cause of legally cognizable injuries, even though the claims like the Juliana case are regularly dismissed or lose on the merits due to separation of powers concerns. The fact is that the science and the event attribution science plays a key role in allowing people even to bring their claims to court. Now, there are a couple of major decisions that may well prove to have significant implications for the role of the science in climate litigation moving forward. This includes the advisory opinion process underway at the International Court of Justice, where oral presentations will begin in just a few weeks, and the advisory opinion process at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is looking at the obligations of nations under inter-American human rights law. Turning to the corporate liability context, and I think where many people most often think about the potential role of event attribution. So one context for the use of science in the courts is liability for corporate contributions to climate change, and we do have more than 24 cases now ongoing here in the United States. I'm actively involved in these cases in my role as of counsel at the law firm Scher Edling, where plaintiffs are seeking monetary damages to help cover adaptation costs, and as well as changes in corporate conduct specifically related to speech. These lawsuits are pursuing public deception claims where liability is based on climate disinformation. But I will note here, and this is something that I think may come up in the questions as well, there is a split in how some of the cases are proceeding. The vast majority of the cases really ground fossil fuel company liability in the notion that because there was early knowledge, deceit and deception and failure to warn and profit from that activity, there's a tortious liability. Those cases do involve event attribution related to wildfires, floods, and other things, but the tortious activity in those cases is about speech, which is an additional causal element that the plaintiffs in those cases have to contend with. There are some cases, including a case in Multnomah County, which is about that heat dome in the Pacific Northwest that was referenced before, a case in Puerto Rico that were brought by municipalities that are about hurricanes and damages from the specific set of hurricanes a few years back, and a case in Boulder County that's related to flooding, the Boulder flooding event that was also referenced, where those cases arguably don't have this deception hook in quite the same way, and where the mere production of the fossil fuels is an important factor or the critical factor in liability. So that causal chain between fossil fuel production and combustion of that product and the extreme events experienced in specific places is directly at stake in those cases. A transnational example of this case is the famous case brought by Saul Yuya, the Peruvian farmer who has brought suit in German court against the power company RWE, seeking compensation for 0.47% of the costs of protecting against a melting glacier above his village and his farm. And that case is premised in sort of a direct connection, a causal connection between RWE's historic contribution of emissions and its proportional liability for the slow onset event ongoing in regards to that glacier. And Rupert Stewart Smith conducted or led a study that looked specifically at that glacier and concluded that there was that the melt was directly attributable to climate change. Adaptation cases and adaptation measures. So attribution science provides actionable information on impacts and hazards of climate change, and this information is used in government decision-making as well as in litigation. And I just want to underscore that because I think that the remit of this panel is beyond just looking at the litigation context. Obviously, you're looking at the at the law, at the legislative, the administrative, the regulatory contexts, the policymaking that agencies and decision makers undertake. And event attribution science and attribution science plays a critical role in a wide range of decisions that are being undertaken. Now, lawsuits that bring challenges around specific failures to prepare for impacts obviously rely on a causal connection and an attribution of specific types of extreme event risks. Lawsuits that challenge the failure to analyze and disclose climate impacts in planning documents, such as in environmental impact reviews or in management plans, similarly rely on those science and the predictive effect of them. The science is also used, as I mentioned before, in legal defense of adaptation measures, which is by looking to past events and prospective future events as the basis for measures undertaken to adapt to climate change. There are a number of cases that have been brought where this is front and center. The Torres Strait Islanders case, a case around heat in Texas, a series of cases brought by Conservation Law Foundation here in the northeastern United States that involve the failure of fossil fuel companies to adapt their coastal infrastructure to the foreseeable risk of sea level rise combined with storm surge in specific events, and a couple of other cases. So then turning to the other contexts, again, some of this will repeat, but in looking at the role of science in government decision-making, we see it in environmental reviews, in natural resource management planning, in review and approval of fossil fuel infrastructure, and in most sort of prevalently in relationship to endangered species protection. The relevant attribution questions that come up in this context: what GHG emissions are attributable to a particular action, and then what impacts are foreseeable and relevant to the action, either on the contribution side or on the adaptation side. As a matter of law, the legal issues that then come up in this are questions around: did the agency account for all of the relevant scientific information? In our government conclusions and decisions, a rational interpretation and a rational application of the scientific information in light of the legal mandates. One example that's frequently referred to in the endangered species management context is the polar bear listing, but I don't think that we need to dwell on the particular instance there. Instead, I think I'll just wrap up and note that at the Sabin Center, we do maintain a database of climate attribution studies that we look at and identify and believe have direct salience for law and policy applications. And this is available at climateattribution.org. We are in the process actually of building up a section of this database that's going to include expert reports that have been submitted and other forms of testimony that have been submitted in climate cases. And so I just refer this to you as a potential resource for your work moving forward. So with that, mindful of the time, I'll wrap up and let's turn it over for any questions that there may be.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate the talk. So yes, open it up to the committee for questions.
Michael, thank you so much for your nice talk. I want to ask you, besides the lawsuits, are there any other ways the science and technology can be used to inform policy or litigation to reduce the impact of extreme weather and climate events? Thank you.
Yes, Grace, I think that there's the utility moves in two directions. The utility moves in regards to looking backwards at extreme events that have transpired and seeking to impose liability for the impacts of those events. And then it also looks forward, right? And it's perspective and the predictive effect of extreme event attribution and the ability to, based on the changing nature, the extremity the extremity, frequency, and intensity of extreme events, and the foreseeability of future events based on the emerging knowledge, right, and the growing knowledge, can also provide a basis for understanding what actions are necessary to protect against future impacts. So that, I mean, that really is the utility, and those are the cases that we've seen. Those are the ways in which we see the science coming to bear in litigation and in other forms of decision making so far. Now, I do want to note that, you know, on the litigation, we have not yet seen any case that has actually reached a conclusion where a court has reached a finding that a particular actor is directly liable for any particular extreme event, you know, and has to pay damages as a result of that event. The closest that we've come to that so far is there were many lawsuits that were filed in the wake of the California wildfires between 2017 and 2020 that were inverse condemnation lawsuits filed against PG&E that amounted to about $30 billion in damages claims, all premised on the idea that PG&E's failure to adapt to the foreseeable risk of wildfire was a cause of the damages experienced by, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. That damage, that threat of liability caused PG&E to go into bankruptcy, and it has emerged, obviously, but that's the closest we've come to kind of any determination of actual liability based on extreme event attribution.
Thank you.
Deputy?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Michael. So I was wondering, in all these litigation cases that you've been involved with, are there issues that come up with the way that attribution science is done? Perhaps there are questions that the studies are not necessarily answering that we could potentially do better at in terms of designing our studies in the future to better inform litigation?
It's a great question, and I think that the short answer is no, and probably or possibly because the litigation just hasn't gotten that far yet. You know, the Trenberth report is probably the most detailed form of this that has been submitted yet, and there was some back and forth in that litigation where there were expert reports that sort of questioned some aspects of the science, but we haven't had a real battle of the experts. And we haven't really had cross-examination of a scientific expert in that. So, you know, storylines versus probable risk, whether FAR is reliable or not, those sorts of questions haven't really come up. And in the international context, and in the context in which we're talking about challenges to agency decisions, judges generally are not going that far into the science. The idea that climate change has increased the intensity, frequency, and severity of extreme events is pretty well understood. Whether any particular event, you know, was caused by climate change to such an extent that someone should be held directly liable for that, we just haven't gotten to that stage yet. So, you know, the answer that I often give to this line of questioning, Dipti, is that you all are the real experts, right? That there's a real, the science drives this more than the litigation drives the science. And I think that the question of that came up earlier about should we be working on the models and not quite the impacts yet, or maybe both at the same time, is a great question for this. And I tend to fall in line with the science needs to keep evolving, and that's what's going to inform the litigation. It'll work the other way around a little bit, but that's the way that's going to be most potent.
Thank you, Michael. Kevin, I see you have your hand up. I just want to make sure, Joyce, you had your hand up. Was that question you were going to ask already asked? If Joyce is out there.
Already asked.
Thank you, Joyce. Kevin.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of a follow-up on the previous question, but and I'm kind of just thinking out loud a little bit, but I'm curious of, right, a few talks ago, Michael Weiner kind of walked through how you can go from the kind of physical changes and work through kind of a series of things that get you to impacts and potentially mortality or costs. But the other side that's come up a few times, but we haven't really dived into much during this open session, has been when you go the other way, which is you go from the change in the event and try to work back to the source of the actual carbon dioxide emissions and what countries and or companies may be responsible for some contribution, accumulated amount over time. I'm curious, is that a gap, right? So there's kind of, we're kind of seeing it, I think, from both ways. You either go source to event or event to impact, but there really is no source all the way to impact. And does that play a role potentially in kind of the legal use of attribution? Or is it, I mean, I completely agree with your previous point, right? Which is the science drives, right, a lot of what's happening. And so, but one of the things that we're trying to do is think about the gaps that might exist. And so I'm just curious, it's kind of an open-ended question, but.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty direct question, Kevin. Is that a gap? I mean, I'm aware of a number of studies that take that like nose to tail approach, right? So Delta's colleague, Brenda Eckwertzel, led a study from Union of Concerned Scientists looking at sea level rise and another study looking at wildfire and sort of tracing those back to particular emitters, right? And can you trace a particular quantity of emissions and how much were those emissions responsible for particular types of impacts? So there are a couple of examples of that, and Justin Mencken and Chris Callahan have written a couple of articles, one that's through and published, that look at the national level, so it's more geared towards the UNFCCC context than the corporate liability context, but look at the contributions of national level emissions to GDP level effects in countries all around the world. So I do think that there are some studies that are out there. It's probably a handful to a dozen at this point altogether. And so it's not necessarily a gap. I see it as an emerging area, and the methodologies and the approaches certainly do require more effort. And when it comes time for those things to really play a role in UNFCCC negotiations, to really inform agency action, or to really survive like courts, courtroom battles and battles of the experts, the further along the science is, the more it's been road tested, different approaches have been adopted, the better off we'll all be.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. I think with that response, we will call the open session to a close, just 2 minutes past schedule. So thanks to all of the speakers for the fantastic presentations. Ted, both Michaels, and Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and thoughts on this. I think the committee has received a lot of valuable information this afternoon that we will certainly continue to deliberate on and discuss. So thank you very much. And with this, I would also like to thank the online participants that have stayed fairly faithful throughout the day for hanging in there with us, and just remind you that you can go to the study website and post comments. And we will have future open information gathering sessions where you can attend and ask questions. So thank you all very much for a very good afternoon here in Washington. Thank you.